Welcome to the Candy Can Show. I'm very happy to have you here. Very excited. Been mind blown by the whatever I've seen of you, your tweets. Everything is very crazy. I think nobody's ever. I can't believe nobody talks about this other than you, as far as I have seen. If you follow like normal media and normal influencers and normal podcasts, even, I've never heard something like it. So maybe you start with your background and then we dive into it.
Yeah, so I'll comment on some of the other stuff later because there is other people talking about this, but it's relatively hidden even in the alternative space.
Yeah.
But my background to get where I am now is really funny to look back on because I was an Army officer at one point. I was a professional athlete at one point, training on the U.S. national team for team handball, which is a sport most Americans don't even know exists.
Big in Austria.
Yeah, huge in Austria. Yeah, I've actually played professionally in Germany for a
Yeah.
bit. Yeah. So, and then played on the U.S. national team. But no one, again, in America knows what handball is. So the U.S. national team hasn't qualified for the Olympics since 1996. But that's another story. We can come back to that if we want to. My journey into the wellness space, so to speak, was a result of both my wife and my mom being chronically ill up to a certain point. So in 2016, right when I commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army, graduated from West Point, I, up to that point, both my wife, who I had just married after commissioning, so I guess at that time my girlfriend, and then also my mom were under the care of traditional allopathic medical doctors. My mom, for the psychiatric side of things, had an immense amount of trauma as a result of the tumultuous and chaotic relationship between her and my dad growing up. And then in roughly 2007, 2008, she went to go see a psychiatrist, and psychiatrist didn't, talk to her about her trauma, address anything to do with nutrition or anything like that, and just prescribed her multiple benzodiazepines and SSRIs, so psychotropic medications. And basically from 2007 up until 2016, my mom's health spiraled downward really fast. And in her down moments, she would not eat for sometimes a week or two, would sit in her bathroom in front of the mirror and just like obsessively picking her face, really wide-eyed in a total state of psychosis, hallucinating, thinking that I was her dad and she was her younger self, not sleeping for sometimes 3 to 4 to 5 days. It was really dark and scary. And at the time, we made no connection that it was likely these psychotropic medications that were causing her to behave this way. We just thought, oh my God, something's wrong with her. She needs to go back to the doctor and get prescribed a different set of drugs. And so she did that a number of times, and she would have up moments. And we're like, oh my God, she's back. And then the down moments would come again, and they'd come back violently. And in 2016, she happened to be seeing a therapist who was reading this book called A Mind of Your Own by Dr. Kelly Brogan. And for those who don't know, Dr. Kelly Brogan was recently, during the COVID era, put on the list called the Disinformation Dozen. So one of the top people spreading, quote, disinformation on the internet. And had you looked her up even in 2015, 2016, you would have found the same stuff with a Google search. You'd find that she's a quack, pseudoscientist, spreading misinformation, et cetera, et cetera. And this therapist that my mom was seeing said, Allie, she still has a practice in New York. I recommend you make an appointment to go see her. And it just so happened that I was graduating from West Point, also in New York. So around the time of my graduation, my mom made an appointment to go see Kelly. And then Kelly sent our family on a trajectory that would transform really all of our lives, because my mom began to show sides of herself that we hadn't seen in nearly 10 years at this point. She began to heal, essentially, right? And it was after getting off all of her psychotropic medications and adopting a natural approach to health, which, when you're going to see a doctor at that time, that sounds so extreme. And after seeing my mom begin to heal, we were like, okay, let's try the same thing for my wife. And so for my wife, she had been under the care of multiple rheumatologists. So she was diagnosed with, quote, lupus and rheumatoid arthritis when she was younger. And for the entire time that I had known her, she was always chronically ill, always inflamed, always complaining about her joints hurting, always complaining about, just her body feeling horrible, like it's breaking down. I remember even prior to us getting married, we had conversations like, where she'd say, I may live a much shorter life. That's just happens sometimes with lupus. I may end up in a wheelchair. I may not be able to have kids. And it never really resonated with me. I was like, there's just no way that's the case. And after seeing my mom begin to heal, we decided to try the same approach with my wife. And in a matter of 3 to 4 months, my wife reversed all of her lupus and rheumatoid arthritis symptoms, and she was feeling incredible. And we had tapered her off all of her medications. She was on a number of medications for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. And after, her beginning to feel so incredible for the first time that she could remember, we went back to her rheumatologist, scheduled an appointment, and got her blood work tested. And I'm pretty skeptical of blood work in general, but just for the sake of this point, it was pretty profound. She got her ESR tested, which is the inflammation levels in your blood, and they were normal for the first time in nearly 10 years. And of course, when we were at the rheumatologist, he was like, okay, well, your blood work's looking great. You should just stay on whatever drugs we have you on. We were like, wait a second. No, we're actually not on any drugs. She's not on any drugs anymore. This is the first time we have not taken the advice of you or any other rheumatologist. You're off all of your medications, and she's feeling way better. And what was shocking to both of us is we would expect that a doctor who now has someone in front of him who is off all of the drugs and is feeling better than ever and is not following his advice would be like, wow, tell me more. How did this happen, right? You'd expect that. That's not what happened. It was like, okay, like shoulder shrug. Okay, looks like you don't need me. And so both of those two experiences were extremely shocking to me, as it would be for anyone, because it's like they were under the care of these people who you would think know best about health, right? And under the care of these people, they were chronically ill. My mom almost dying, right? And then once they stopped listening to these people and started listening to what the mainstream allopathic scientific community calls pseudoscience and quackery and misinformation, they began to heal. So after just essentially entering to be an agent of the government because I was an officer in the United States Army, I started going down this rabbit hole of questioning everything I had been taught to accept, as we are all taught to accept in Western societies, about health. And once I started peeling back the onion, so to speak, I, of course, started with nutrition and found out how much the food pyramid that's promoted by the USDA and FDA is total nonsense. And then, of course, it went into psychotropic medications, especially because of what happened with my mom. And then my wife and I got pregnant. So naturally, the next thing that happened was, okay, what about vaccines? I mean, if they're lying about these psychotropic medications and the same companies make vaccines as well, we should probably look into those. And then once we go down that rabbit hole, you then go into how the government, the three-letter agencies, the CDC, the FDA are extremely corrupt. And so that made me start questioning the government itself as an officer in the United States Army, which led to questioning 9/11, which led to questioning everything else, and just the rabbit hole kind of spiraled downwards. So by the time COVID happened, I had already done a tremendous amount of research on government corruption, pharmaceutical industry corruption, collusion between the two. And I could see very clearly what was going on. And I already knew that I wanted to get out of the Army. But then as soon as COVID came around, I was like, all right, I need to get the hell out of here as soon as possible, because I was still in the Army when COVID first happened. And I essentially started using my social media to share my thoughts. That's it. I just would screenshot a tweet and share what I thought about something. And my account started to grow, and I amassed a pretty significant following. And the other piece of this, which is what we'll get into next, because I'm sure after watching that video. So for those who are listening or watching this, The video that he was referencing at the very beginning of this is on my Twitter. So if you just search Alec_Zeck on Twitter, it's the pinned tweet, and it's a presentation that I gave at the Wise Tradition Conference put on by Weston A. Price Foundation in Kansas City this last year. But in 2020, I was under the impression that vaccines were, ineffective at providing immunity, so to speak, towards viral illnesses, and that they contain neurotoxins, which the second part is true, but the first part I was under the impression of. And then I come across this video from this guy named Dr. Tom Cowan, and then another video a couple weeks later where David Icke was being interviewed on London Real back in April of 2020 by this, and he was talking about this guy named Dr. Andy Kaufman. And both Dr. Tom Cowan and Dr. Andy Kaufman were talking about how there's actually no evidence that viruses exist. And when I first heard that, I was like, what the hell? Like there's just no way. How do you explain this? How do you explain that? How do you explain that? There's so many questions that come up when you hear this. But Tom gave a really incredible example. If you were following dolphins off the coast of Florida and you noticed that the dolphins began to get sick in large numbers, what would be your first thought? It would likely be who put some shit in the water that is causing the dolphins to become sick, right? Like who poisoned the water in that area. Absolutely. We don't think when it comes to nature, oh my God, what virus is causing these dolphins? Do we ever think that? No, we don't. It's always who cut off their food source, who poisoned the water supply, who ruined their habitat. It's one of those things. It's never, oh my God, what virus is spreading amongst these dolphins to cause them to become sick? So when he said that, we were just dealing with a situation where we had been living in housing on the military base we were stationed at. And military housing is notoriously toxic. We were living in a house that had like encapsulated lead paint. It was built in the 1910s. They just like Jimmy rigged some fucking, am I allowed to cuss? Mm-hmm. Okay. Jimmy rigged some fucking like AC units in the house. So there's like swampy, stagnant air. And my wife, her autoimmune symptoms came back for the first time in nearly 4 years, right? And we were like, well, okay, well, what's different? Like, we're not eating differently. We're not more stressed than we were previously, like maybe a little bit because we don't know what's going to happen with the world at this point because, quote, COVID. But what's going on? And as soon as we moved out of that house, again, changing our environment, she began to feel better again. We were like, oh my God. So as I was hearing this example from Dr. Cowan about dolphins off the coast of Florida and hearing this idea that viruses don't actually exist, my life experience was showing me, oh, my wife, her symptoms were coming back as we were living in a toxic environment. Had I not been exposed to these videos, I'd been like, oh my God, what viral illness, what dormant virus does she have that has now been activated? And then we moved to a new place and she started feeling better again. So then I started going down this rabbit hole basically from 2020 through 2023, again, after having done research on the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, vaccines, and realizing that this is a strong statement for those who have not heard this before. And there's a lot of context required, which I'm sure we'll get into. But there is actually zero empirical scientific evidence that viruses exist or cause any sort of disease whatsoever. And again, that statement is a loaded statement that's like, dude, what? But we can get into any questions you have with respect to that.
It's so funny because first, when I listened to that video, I was like, now it all makes sense. Like, that really completes everything I've been going through because my son got COVID and we just didn't. Mm-hmm. Even though we were around him, we shared a bed, we were in the same room at all times, right?
Yeah.
And I did not distance. I didn't wear a mask. I didn't do anything because I was like, I don't care. I'm not gonna, like, it's bad enough. I will not isolate him, like, on top of that. Anyways, we would ask the doctors, how is it possible that he has COVID and we don't have COVID? We just didn't get it. After weeks and weeks, and we would test and try to figure it out, and nobody had an answer. And
you test negative?
Yes.
Well, yeah, it's funny, right?
And I tested him a couple times because I didn't believe the test anyways, but they came out positive every time, which also is a whole nother topic. But it was just so odd to me that we would not catch it. It would not make any sense to me, and nobody had an answer. And then once you, in your video, you speak about how it's not person to person, how that is not a thing with anything really, that the illness either starts in your mind or in your environment or in the toxins that you feed yourself, but not from person to person. But imagine what that would mean for the pharmaceutical industry or for pharma industry, because now if it's not person to person, then there is no fear. That destroys the whole isolation, that destroys the fear driven propaganda that they feed us, and that would really take away everything.
It'd take away everything.
Yeah.
And the whole pharmaceutical paradigm, especially with respect to so-called infectious diseases, is predicated on the idea that there are these scary things that are being passed from person to person that are submicroscopic, so you can't see them with the naked eye, so they could be anywhere at any time. And only we can know about them as the experts, and only we have the solution to combat that thing. It's a play on the war model that is no different than terrorism after 9/11. It's that, oh my God, terrorism could be anywhere and everywhere, so we need to implement all of these safety measures to combat terrorism. And you, as a citizen, can't possibly know where these terrorists are, who they are, so you need to be vigilant and scared and fearful of everything, and you need to have some of your rights taken away. And don't worry, we'll look after you implementing these safety measures. It's the same thing. But with respect to person to person, so what you're talking about there is this idea that not only have viruses not been shown to exist or cause any sort of disease, and we can get into all the scientific details of that, and I think it's important too, but a step above that, without arguing the molecular details, so to speak, is that in the countless experimental attempts to show that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person, meaning the cough or the snot, or being in proximity to and swapping fluids with a sick person, is completely unproven. It is a completely unproven paradigm of illness. And again, because this belief is so entrenched into our collective psyche, when I say that statement, people will be like, yeah, right, dude, this is a well-established scientific fact. And it's like, it's actually not. If you look at the countless, and I say countless, I think we meaning myself and several other people, I got to give credit to a few people actually right now. Mike Stone from virallig.com, I'll send that to you so you can put in the show notes. And then there's this incredible thread by this guy named Jamie on Twitter, who's documented upwards of 64 studies attempting to demonstrate that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person. So one well-known study, as an example, was called the Rosenau experiments during the height of the Spanish flu. So again, the Spanish flu, a lot of people died. It's pretty well documented that there are people dying in large numbers at that point in time. But what we're attempting to find is what is the cause for people dying, right? It's important to distinguish the cause from the effect. So there is an effect, there's people dying, or in any other case, people getting sick. Okay, so what is the cause of that phenomenon, right? So in these experiments during the Spanish flu, Milton Rosenau took over 100 volunteers who were not presently sick, who had not been sick, and exposed them via various methods to either sick people directly or to fluids from sick people. He took blood from sick people who were sick with the Spanish flu, right, a really deadly illness, and injected it directly into these healthy people. He took nasal secretions from Spanish flu patients and swabbed the back of the healthy volunteers' throats. He had 13 volunteers go into a Spanish flu ward, had those patients, had several of them open mouth cough directly in the volunteers' faces, had them shake hands, had them talk at close range, had them interact with each other. And the results of the experiment were that 0 out of the 100 volunteers became sick. So Milton Rosenau, of course, was shocked because he already had the presupposition that this illness had to be spread by the fluids of a sick person. There's just no other possibility. And the results of these experiments were that 0 of the 100 volunteers became sick. So he is quoted as saying something to the effect of, we entered this outbreak thinking that we knew the cause of disease. Again, already assuming it must be caused by this. But when they tested that hypothesis, it came out the results were that no one became sick. And that's just one of countless experiments. There's another one that was done, I think, a year later. I want to say it's by this scientist named Waugh, if I remember correctly, where he had what would be considered a somewhat adequate control group. And what that means is he took some people and exposed them to snot from a sick person. A few of the people did get sick, but more importantly, and this kind of shows you the power of belief, and I'll touch on something with respect to COVID here in a second. He took another set of people and exposed them to saline, again, thinking that they were receiving fluids from a sick person, but it was just an inert saline placebo, right? More people became sick after being exposed to the saline placebo than those who were exposed to the fluids of a sick person, which is pretty interesting because it's like, wow, was it because they believed that they were going to be given fluids from a sick person? So it kind of shows the impact of belief. But there are countless experiments just like this where fluids from a sick person, even chickenpox pustules, even fluids from chickenpox people, like from the actual pox-like lesions on their arm, were delivered to healthy people, both orally and also rubbed on their skin, and nothing happened. There's accounts of various so-called infectious diseases attempting to demonstrate that it is passed via the fluids of a sick person, and all of them turned out to show the exact opposite, that nothing happens. And of course, there are people who will cite studies saying that, well, this demonstrates that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person. But if you go read those studies, and again, this is where it's so important. This is what I learned in 2020. Previously, when I would read scientific papers, I would just look at the abstract, just like the summary, right? Either the abstract summary or just the conclusions. The most important part of a scientific paper is the methods section, because the methods section highlights the exact steps that the scientist or scientists took in their experiment, exactly the procedure that they followed to be able to form the conclusion that they have. And if you read the methods section of any of these papers claiming to show that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person, or claiming to show that disease is spread in animal models, it'll go something like this. They'll take a rat, or here, I'll use rabies as an example. They took both a rabbit and a bat who were sick. After the rabbit and bat died, they then took brain fluid. Actually, no, they took the brains and the spinal cord out of the animals. They grind them up. They take a little bit of that substance and add it to saline. And then they injected it directly into the heads of other rabbits, literally directly into their brains. And of course, those rabbits became sick. And they said, voila, we have proved the contagion of rabies. Does that represent anything that happens in nature? Or another example, they'll take a rabbit that was raised in a lab, isolated from other rabbits, so not in its natural environment, eating an unnatural diet, not eating what rabbits are supposed to be eating, probably in a perpetual state of fear because it's in a freaking lab and not in nature as rabbits are supposed to be, right? And under fluorescent lights, possibly exposed to other experiments, and then they'll take unfiltered fluid from a sick person, mix it up on a cell culture, and then inject that directly into the rabbit, or pump an absurd amount of it into its lungs. And then the rabbit will sometimes get sick, sometimes it'll die, and they'll be like, voila, we've proved contagion. It's like, that does not represent anything that happens in nature. And again, in the countless experimental attempts to demonstrate something that would more resemble what they think happens in nature, with this idea that disease is transmitted via snot or via, coughing, they're unable to demonstrate it. And then last thing, I know I'm rambling here, but to go back to the belief aspect of this, right? Of course, I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Joe Dispenza, Dr. Bruce Lipton, who talk about the biology of belief and how our belief absolutely has an impact on the outcomes of our lives, especially with respect to health. But the CDC put out a study that was published in July of 2021 that looked at 550,000, give or take, people who had died in a hospital after being labeled as a COVID death, right? And I say labeled and put emphasis on labeled as a COVID death because COVID means jack shit really at this point. But 550,000 people who were labeled as a COVID death. The second strongest risk factor for death associated with COVID was fear/anxiety related disorders, which again would imply that when you have a strong belief, especially a strong fear-based belief surrounding something, it is likely to produce an outcome that matches that belief. I mean, we all know, it's pretty well established at this point, when you have a perpetual fear response, your body produces chemicals that are inflammatory towards your body, that are toxic towards your body, especially in prolonged states, right? So this study that was published by the CDC, I wish more people would talk about it because it highlights how big of an impact perpetual fear and anxiety plays in our life, which you would expect people to question, well, it's interesting that their own data says that fear and anxiety is such a big factor in this. Why is it that the same agencies who determined this with this study and various other studies kept us in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety? Why would they do that if their own data is telling them that fear and anxiety has such a tremendous impact on this disease? So, yeah.
Well, maybe they know what they're doing.
Exactly.
I mean, if you look at the stats, and you can really see, even if you believe what you're saying or if you don't believe it, but if the lockdowns didn't help at all, if not the opposite, everything that America did, especially now that I'm diving into the real face of Anthony Fauci, when you look at just the statistics without any opinion, you can really tell that the isolation created much more illness than it solved. And when you look at your own life, when you tell me these things, they sound crazy. But when I ask myself, did I get sick without meeting a sick person? I would have to say yes.
Yeah.
And did I meet a lot of sick people and did not get sick? Also yes, And how do people work in hospitals? It would be impossible. With mask, no mask. Before COVID, nobody was wearing a mask ever.
Yeah.
Besides when they're doing surgery. Right, they would put on their fancy suits and do all that, but before that there was nothing. Nobody would wash their hands, nobody would wear a mask, and the doctors would never get sick, or like not in an outrageous mode where you have no doctors working because they were exposed to viruses all day, every day.
Exactly, and
so that really shows like how weirdly made up everything is at this point.
Exactly. I mean, and then on top of that, I remember back in 2020, 2021, seeing a thread, or I forget where I saw it, but it was doctors and nurses who work in a hospital setting who are describing getting their titers tested to see if they have any immunity to various so-called viral illnesses that they were exposed to on a day-to-day basis, allegedly. And they didn't even have documented or demonstrated immunity, and antibody tests and titer tests are complete nonsense. But the point is that after being exposed repeatedly to these, quote, viral illnesses, the excuse is always, well, you likely have antibodies towards that, or you have immunity towards that. But then they would go get their immunity tested for these various illnesses, essentially, and it would come back negative that they don't have immunity. So they're like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. I'm exposed to this all the time. How am I not getting sick? And there are countless examples of exactly what you say that I can highlight in my life. I was just having a conversation with my friend about this yesterday, actually, where he said, when you think back on all the times that you've been sick, and I can't think of every single example, but are you sure that you can attribute it to something other than coming into contact with someone? And I would say for the most part, yes. But there are examples. I'm a dad. I have 2 kids where two people seem to get sick one right after the other. And it's like, that seems like a contagious illness. And we can set that aside for a second and come back to it because there's some pretty amazing explanations for that. But virtually every time in my life that I've been sick, I can trace it back to something, whether it's some stress that I was under, perpetual stress where I was just like very, very, very tense, that then produced symptoms of illness, or where I had been eating like shit or drinking a bunch of alcohol or staying out late at night and then I got sick afterwards, or seasonality. I mean, as I've come to understand it and think how brilliant our bodies are, before we're heading into winter months where we'll be exposed to less sunlight, we'll be exposed to more time indoors amongst toxic building materials. The glues and adhesives that are in our home are not ideal for humans, right? Especially in prolonged periods. So, but after being inside or when we're coming onto a season where we're going to be inside for prolonged periods, we're not going to be sweating as much. So we're not detoxing as much. We're exposed to less sunlight. We're eating a lot more food for some of us, especially in the US where we have 4 holidays back to back: Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, where we're eating and drinking like absolute dog shit. Spending time with people we think we love, but a lot of us are pretty stressed out when we're around family members. So you know how that goes. But our bodies are brilliant because prior to going into that phase where all of those things are happening, or sometimes during that, our bodies will get sick and we'll experience symptoms of illness. We'll have diarrhea, we'll sweat a lot, we'll get a fever, our body will heat up a lot to purge all the liquids out of us. We'll sneeze, we'll cough, we'll throw up. And we call it, quote, flu season. But as I've come to understand it, it's just our bodies, and this is my hypothesis, preparing itself for a long season where we will be accumulating more toxins, spending, again, less time in sunlight, sweating much less for those of us who don't work out adequately, And then when the springtime comes around, after we've accumulated a certain amount of toxins, what happens again? We get sick. That's why people get sick seasonally. I mean, it's no different than in the spring or in the fall, the trees shed their leaves. They shed some of the baggage to conserve energy for the winter months. And then when winter is over, they start producing leaves again. They start producing fruit again. And why would our bodies be any different in that respect? So any time in my life that I've been sick, I can attribute it to something like that, some change in nutrition, some change in environment. Another example that I brought up to my friend yesterday is, have you ever grown a plant under grow lights inside, started with seedlings? Okay. So when you start with seedlings inside, there's this process as you're transferring them outside called weatherizing, which is where you want to slowly, incrementally expose those seedlings more and more to outside, because a drastic change in environment can sometimes elicit a response in the plants that can cause them to die. So likewise, is it possible that, when we travel or when we go visit somewhere and change our environment? As an example, I was just in Hawaii for 12 days, right? Prior to leaving for Hawaii, I didn't have any sinus issues or anything like that. I was in Hawaii. I was eating pretty shitty compared to how I typically eat. My wife and I were drinking a little bit of alcohol. We got to have a pina colada while we're in Hawaii, and I typically don't drink at all. But then I was also in a new environment, much more humid in Hawaii. So I started getting some sinus issues. Previously, I'd have been like, oh my God, I traveled and I was exposed to someone who has a virus. But now it's an understanding that no, it's very simple. I had a change in environment. I'm eating less. My body's adapting to this environment. I'm sleeping less. I have 2 kids. They're barely sleeping. The first night, my daughter was up at 3:30 in the morning, ready to go. I'm like, oh my God, you got to sleep. That's why I started getting some sinus issues. And what's incredible about this whole paradigm, going back to what I said about how the pharmaceutical industry puts you in a victim mentality where you require their stuff. I'm a victim to my circumstances. I need what they have. I need their solutions. This puts the onus on you as an individual to understand that my health is overwhelmingly a result of my choices. My body and its ability to thrive is based on my environment, my lifestyle habits, my beliefs, and my thoughts. It is the most empowering position to take because you understand that overwhelmingly, and of course, they're spraying shit in the sky and they poison our food and things like this, don't get me wrong, but overwhelmingly, especially when you become aware of that, your health is a result of your compounding choices on a day-to-day basis. And last thing I'll say, jumping back to, when 2 or more people get sick in the same space, right? When I talked about when one of my kids gets sick, it sure seems like the other one gets sick. And for someone who's not attuned to what I and Dr. Cowan, Dr. Kaufman, and others have been looking into, you would say, well, that clearly demonstrates that fluids from a sick person cause another person to get sick. But we always have to reference back to those studies in which they've attempted to demonstrate this. And every single one of them that uses what would be considered natural means fails, right? So because of that, you have to begin to explore other possible explanations for what causes one person to get sick right after the other. And again, we can go back to shared lifestyle, shared environment, shared eating habits, shared emotional dysregulation, shared emotional trauma, shared suppressed trauma, right? A unique combination of those factors, shared exposure to non-native electromagnetic fields and radiation. But even if those aren't sufficient to describe what is going on, the other possible explanations for what causes one person to get sick right after the other are this. So the National Institute of Health coined the term the human biofield to describe the electromagnetic field that surrounds the human body. Just like our phones, like when I was texting you the other day, that's communicating via various electromagnetic fields, right? I don't know exactly how it works with cell phones. I think it goes to a tower somewhere, then it pings to you, but that's communicating being via fields and information is shared within those fields. Is it too implausible to say that, especially when we're around each other for extended periods of time, that our fields would begin to sync up and be sharing energetic information intimately, where one of us begins to get sick and we say, oh man, my body needs to detox right now. So I'm going to experience coughing, sneezing, I'm going to throw up, I'm going to have diarrhea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to energetically communicate that to other people who I've shared an environment with, because it's likely that their bodies are also in need of a detox because we've shared environments with them for extended periods of time. So if you are in need of a detox, you detox. You experience sweating, sneezing, all the other things, right? And if you're not, if your body hasn't reached a certain threshold, your body's like, nah, I'm good. I don't need to. I'll do it later. So you don't have a detox at that time. Or maybe you're working out a lot more. Maybe you're somatically releasing your stored trauma and not in a heightened state of stress. Maybe you're eating different than the other people in that environment. Maybe you're eating more clean than they are. Maybe you're getting better sleep. Maybe you're spending more time outside in the sun. So it's like, no, my body's good. I've been adequately detoxing, so I don't need to detox right now. Isn't it like, it's plausible, right? And I want to emphasize something here, because people will say that, oh, so you're saying that it must be this other thing that is the cause of this phenomenon. I want to be clear here. There is not adequate scientific studies that have been conducted on this idea that I'm presenting here. There's plenty of research that needs to be done. But the reality is, because we've been so, myopically focused on this idea that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person, that it's a virus or a bacteria that is causing us to become ill, we aren't looking at these other possible explanations. So yes, I acknowledge more research needs to be done, but that's one of many plausible explanations for what causes this phenomenon. I think it makes sense.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, but if this generation hates anything, it's self-accountability. If this generation hates anything, it's being responsible for your own life and your own body. It gives me like goosebumps to think that it's very empowering to think that everything is up to you. I always love that about everything. I don't know if you listen to Sad Guru, but I always have to laugh at this so much. He always says, like, if I say bad words to you in a different language and I smile at you, you'll smile back and you'll think I'll said something really nice. But if I attack you in English, you create something in your mind and you hurt yourself. Mm-hmm. Right? Same as when you have a car accident and you look at the car, it hurts you because you identify with my car is broken, so I am broken. Or if you drop your phone, it creates pain inside of your body. And it's very easy to show that nothing happened to you at all, but you're in pain. You put yourself in pain, or you get a phone call by the IRS and your heart races like crazy, right? Or a math test, or you name it, but you create every disease, every pain is created by yourself. And he also said, like, pain is the best thing ever, because otherwise we would just run around like GTA and throw ourselves off buildings if we don't have pain. So pain is like the best thing you can have, because it saves you, right? It keeps you alive. But most pain, 99% of the pain that you have is self-created. It's not somebody hitting you or somebody like poking you with a knife. Most pain on a daily basis, when I wake up and I'm in pain, it's because I create it. I don't feel good enough. I feel stressed out about going viral or making more money or providing for my family, but there's nothing really happening at all. It is all the pain that we create inside. So it would make the most sense that you also create so-called viruses or so-called illnesses. And it makes total sense to me. It was weird at first, but you go from calling COVID a flu, and then you go from the flu to calling it that you just are sick. But also, like when you say that I guess contagion works if you just tell yourself long enough that you make me sick and you made me sick. Eventually, you'll be sick.
Yeah.
Because you just tell yourself long enough, so you'll have it at some point.
Yeah, I love what you brought up from Sadhguru because it's such a perfect example of what we're talking about here. Like how do I put this? Your environment is likely the results you experience in your life are likely a reflection of your thoughts and your feelings about something. And again, we can go back to referencing that CDC study that I brought up, right? And when it comes to trauma itself, and this is a tough one for people to wrap their minds around, when it comes to a negative emotional experience, a very traumatic incident that someone experienced, what Sadhguru is pointing to there is that it is 100% a creation of the mind, because especially after the event has happened itself, the event is no longer happening to you. So you are perpetuating your own suffering by having an egoic attachment to whatever had occurred to you previously, or by worrying about something that is going to occur in the future. That thing is not currently here happening now. It's only happening inside of your mind. Like, I could go off, start thinking about all of the shitty things that happened yesterday or 2 years ago or like a week ago, whatever. But the reality is I'm right here with you in this room having a conversation. Those things aren't happening now. There's no threat to me here right now. The only thing that's happening right now is me and you communicating in this room. So when it comes to trauma, people are perpetuating their own suffering by having an attachment to something that previously occurred that is not happening right now. It is not here present with us. The only thing that is present is that thought in our mind. It's not actually real. It's not here in reality with us. And that has also huge implications on disease itself.
So would you say that there's no virus at all that can be from one body to another body? Because I have another funny story for you.
Yeah, go.
Wait.
Yeah, go ahead.
You gotta hear this out.
Okay.
Before I met my wife, I had sex with somebody who had an STD.
Mm-hmm.
And we had unprotected sex many times before I found out.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I have this STD now. So I got it checked. I don't have the STD.
So
nobody had an answer for me until I met you.
Well, there's your answer. So
how is that possible?
It's
you
funny.
Sleep with somebody who doesn't have with an STD and you don't have the STD. And I just had Tim Kennedy on, and he had sex with somebody who had AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
And he tried to like almost kill himself because he thought he had AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have AIDS. so and then you're like, okay, it's God, it's a miracle. But I mean, it makes things very plausible. And how many times have you heard about somebody going to a COVID party and don't get COVID? Or you met so many people, they all have COVID, and you just don't. It just seems so weird. You don't catch it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, okay.
Maybe you just can't catch it like that. But maybe if you put yourself in the same environment, you eat the same shit, you get the seed oils, you eat the bugs, watch Netflix every night, you're inflamed as fuck, you spend all day inside, you look at your screen and you feel like a piece of shit, eventually you'll have COVID.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if you don't meet a single person.
Yeah, dude. the number of times that I've heard stories like this now is incredible. How many people have had, sex with someone else or been exposed to someone who I've had people message me like, just to test your theory, I went and like drank after someone who was deathly sick with something, or I had someone like make out with me who was really, really sick with something and nothing happened to me. And in this book called Virus Mania, which documents everything that I'm discussing here, it's written by Torsten Engelbrecht, Dr. Sam Bailey, Dr. Stefano Scoglio, and Klaus Konlin. It's an incredible book. And in Virus Mania, they go into incredible detail on the HIV/AIDS era. And they describe in that book, and then there's also another book called What Really Makes You Ill by Don Lester and David Parker, and then, of course, The Contagion Myth by Dr. Tom Cowan. Countless books talking about this. But in these various books, they talk about that there are countless examples where a husband, wife, or a girlfriend or boyfriend is in a relationship with someone who is tested positive for HIV and has, quote, AIDS, right? And they repeatedly have sex with that person and nothing happens to them. Countless experiences just like this. And when it comes, so your original question is there no virus? So,
But it's different if you have sex with somebody and you know.
It is, because even in your mind, you're like, oh shit,
I'm doing this right now.
Yeah, I'm doing this.
I am getting it, and you're getting it.
Yeah, and it still may be that you may not get it. I'm not going to say that our mind is the only thing that has an impact, but I would say it is one of the strongest things that has an impact on the outcomes of our lives.
Just think about it. You can have pain in a ligament that you don't have anymore.
Yeah.
Like,
Isn't that
how
weird?
does that work?
Yeah, it's the mind. Or like, so you cut off your arm and you have like that phantom limb thing where you're like, I feel pain in my whole arm, and you don't even have that arm anymore, right? I mean, that's
or you go in the cold plunge and you feel pain. I feel pain. I feel it.
Mm-hmm.
I've had people in it and they're like, I feel so much pain. And I tell them, you're just making it up. There is no pain.
Yeah.
Your mind is the most powerful thing in the world. I do believe that.
Yeah. I think it is the most powerful thing. I wouldn't say that it is the only factor at play, obviously, right? I mean, if you lived right next to some of like the most heavy radiation in the world, you're probably going to end up getting sick, right? But it is one of the biggest factors. So to your question, are there no viruses? That is a good question, because this is the best way to describe this. And this is where we'll get into the details on virology itself, where they have ushered in an unproven pseudoscientific paradigm under the guise of, quote, science and, quote, well-established science. And that has serious implications for health of everyone, especially because that ushered in the entire vaccine program. That's literally what led to vaccines and various pharmaceutical companies making billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, right? So if I say that X exists and causes Y, I need direct proof that X exists and causes Y. And I'll use another analogy here. And this comes from Dr. Tom Cowan's book, The Contagion Myth, which is an incredible book. So if I were to tell you that a ping pong ball could break down a brick wall, of course you'd want to see evidence of that claim, right? Because it's like, yeah, bullshit, dude. Show me some evidence that a ping pong ball can do that, right? I'm talking the standard ping pong ball here, not some like metal object that's fired through a gun. Literally just a ping pong ball. So in order to prove my claim or establish my claim that a ping pong ball can break down a brick wall, the first thing that I do is I pour a bunch of corrosive acid on the brick wall. And then I take a giant mallet and smash the brick wall several times, making it start to crumble. And then I tape the ping pong ball to a giant boulder. And then I swing it at the brick wall with a crane. And the brick wall falls down. Voila. I have demonstrated that the ping pong ball caused the destruction of that brick wall. So anyone with any logic whatsoever would look at that and be like, no, the fuck you haven't, dude. The ping pong ball had no effect. It was pouring the corrosive acid. It was smashing it with a mallet several times. It was whirling a boulder at the brick wall that caused the brick wall to fall down, not this ping pong ball. So how does that relate to virology? If I were to tell you that no virus has been isolated, purified, characterized, or sequenced directly from the fluids of a sick person where it is claimed to exist, right? Because that's where they claim that it exists. They claim that it travels via our fluids to another person. That it has never been isolated, purified, characterized, or sequenced directly from the fluids of a sick person, and it has never been established to exist. You would say, okay, Alec. And then you would go on to PubMed or Google Scholar, look up a number of peer-reviewed studies that do exist, that are, quote, peer-reviewed, that in the title say isolation characterization of, insert virus. and let's say in this case SARS-CoV-2. And in the abstract of that paper, they'll briefly describe how they isolated and purified a characterized and sequenced a virus coming from X patient and X location. So you would then send that to me and say, dude, there are thousands of studies just like this. How can you possibly be making a claim so absurd like this? This is the problem. Going back to what I talked about with reading scientific papers before. If you read the methods section, which lays out the procedure that they used to be able to come to that conclusion, you will find that it actually relates to exactly what I was just talking about with the ping pong ball. Because here's what happens. In every single, I say this with emphasis, every single example of scientists demonstrating that a virus exists and causes disease, the experiment goes like this, with some minor variations here and there. They take snot from a sick person that they assume contains the virus. They never verify or validate that there is a virus or virus particles inside that snot from a sick person. They then add that snot to a foreign cell culture, which is typically comes from a monkey kidney cell. So it's a bunch of cells coming from an adult green monkey. Sometimes they'll use aborted fetal cells. Sometimes they'll use cancer cells. They'll use other cell lines, but it's typically cells from an adult green monkey. So they'll add this mixture of fluids from a sick person that is unpurified. And in an unpurified mixture of fluids from a sick person contains countless things: food particles, debris, dust, your own just endogenous material from your body, bacteria, fungi, and other things. And they'll sometimes filter it. But most importantly, they also add that fluid before delivering it to this monkey kidney cell to this substance called viral transport medium. Inside viral transport medium, at a minimum, contains amphotericin B, which is an antimycotic that is essentially used to keep the experiment free of fungal growth. And then they'll add, or inside viral transport medium is also gentamicin, which is an antibiotic, which keeps the culture sterile and free of bacterial growth. And I'll get to why that's an issue in a second. So again, fluid from a sick person assumed to contain a virus. Never validate that a virus is actually there. They then add that to viral transport medium, which contains those two substances that I was just talking about. They then add that mixture to a monkey kidney cell or another cell line. And then they'll add more amphotericin B, more gentamicin. They'll then sometimes add trypsin, which is something that breaks down proteins essentially. Then they'll add Delbecco's modified eagle medium or Delbecco's minimal essential medium and fetal bovine serum, which are essentially food sources for the cell, right? But what's interesting is in viral cell cultures, they drop the nutrient intake relative to other cultures, meaning that they're dropping the amount of food that they're providing for the cell. Following? So after all of these substances have been added to this monkey kidney cell, the cell breaks down into a bunch of fragments, basically dying, right? Experiencing what is known as the cytopathic effect. They then take those fragments from the cells that have experienced the cytopathic effect and prepare them for electron microscopy, which we can get to in a minute. And then they produce these black and white electron micrograph images and point to the particles on the images and say, voila, these are viruses. These must be what was inside the fluids of a sick person. Never mind that we never showed that they were there. Never mind we never validated that they were actually present. These must be what caused the cell to break down, experiencing the cytopathic effect. Never mind that we added gentamicin and amphotericin B, which if you were to Google amphotericin B toxic kidneys, keep this in mind because remember, it's a monkey kidney cell that they're putting it on, right? If you were to Google amphotericin B toxic kidneys, gentamicin toxic kidneys, you would find a number of results that describe how both of those substances are well established to be toxic to kidneys and are commonly the cause of renal failure, which is kidney failure. So it's interesting because they're adding those substances, right, to a monkey kidney cell, assuming that it has no negative effect on the cell. They say that it's just there, again, to keep the experiment free of bacterial growth and fungal growth, which, makes sense. But again, the fatal assumption is that it has no negative effect on a monkey kidney cell when it's well established that amphotericin B and gentamicin are cytotoxic specifically to kidneys, right? You following what I'm saying here? So essentially, after they have starved and poisoned the cell, starved by reducing the nutrient intake, poisoned the cell by adding amphotericin B, gentamicin, and other toxic substances like trypsin, the cell breaks down into a bunch of fragments. And then they just point to those fragments on electron micrograph images and say, voila, these are virus particles. This must have been what was inside the fluids of a sick person. This must be what caused the cell to break down, experiencing the cytopathic effect. And the problem with that, going back to what I said, if you say that X exists and causes Y, you need direct observational proof that X exists. In every single electron micrograph image or other type of microscope image of viruses, they come as a result of the experiment that I've just described. Never in the history of virology have they isolated, purified, characterized, and sequenced viruses directly from the fluids of a sick person, meaning they have never, ever, ever demonstrated that viruses actually exist inside the fluids of a sick person, and they have never been able to image them directly in the fluids of a sick person. They have never been able to take them out of the fluids of a sick person and expose them to healthy people or healthy cells and produce a result. Going back to those experiments we described earlier, a step above those molecular details, they've never even been able to demonstrate that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person. But coming back to these molecular details, right? They've never demonstrated that viruses actually exist. Now, when it comes to bacteria, we've demonstrated that bacteria exist. Like bacteria absolutely exist. We can see them. We can purify them, right? We can purify them directly from the fluids of a sick person. When it comes to viruses, though, we have never been able to demonstrate that they actually exist. And there are countless directions we can go with this, but one thing that I'd like to add, there's a virologist, he wouldn't call himself a virologist anymore, but a virologist by the name of Stefan Lanka, German virologist. And he has done a control experiment, meaning that he followed the exact same steps that virologists do to isolate viruses, which I just described, adding it to viral transport medium, adding all to the monkey kidney cell with all those other substances, et cetera, et cetera. Stefan Lanka did the exact same thing without any fluid from a sick person present, which would mean no possible source of a virus present, right? So didn't use any fluid from a sick person, but added all the same substances in the exact same concentrations that virologists do. Meaning he added amphotericin B, he added gentamicin, fetal bovine serum, all the same things to the monkey kidney cell. Guess what happened?
Same thing.
The exact same thing, exactly. The exact same thing happened without any possible source of, quote, SARS-CoV-2 or another virus present, which would then mean that the results that virologists point to as evidence, and again, this is the foundational evidence for virology. I want to emphasize that. It is the foundation for all of virology, for all of the measures that happened over the last 3.5 years, all of the tyranny, all of the lockdowns, all of the masking, social distancing, the economic impact, all the people who took the vaccines and are having negative experiences because of it. Every single thing funnels back to this experiment that I'm describing right here. That is how they establish that SARS-CoV-2 exists. That right there. And Stefan Lanka has already demonstrated that the results of those experiments are complete nonsense. And again, we have a layer above that they haven't even demonstrated that disease is spread via the fluids of a sick person. So in summary, to answer your question regarding is there any viruses, every single example of establishing the existence of a virus uses those exact same methods. So you tell me, what do you think?
It sounds like to me, it sounds like Hollywood.
Yeah.
It sounds like people are sick. Well, if I was a pharmaceutical company, right, I would ride out as long as I can, make the most money, and when people get tired of it, I come up with a new thing. It might be the same thing. It might be just the flu again. I'll just call it something else.
Yeah.
And then people get obsessed. And then maybe I fucked up a little bit and I pushed the monkeypox in a little too early. And it was just the timing was off. But we'll redo it. We'll give them wait until the winter comes and people get actually sick,
Yeah.
and we'll scare the shit out of him again,
Yep.
and we'll make a couple more guys millionaires. And it seems like it's. I always wondered how, we're getting so advanced, the medicine getting better and better, but there's always a new sickness every year. There's always something new. It's like you can't keep up.
Yeah.
They're like, oh my God, there's a new thing. Have you
Yeah.
heard of this new thing? It's just like a movie premiere, just like a new movie or a new, like, they write it out and then they go to the next thing. And it seems like there's like, of course, people are sick and dying, but it seems like there is a very good connection to what you surround yourself with,
Mhm.
and the whole fear factor, and the whole food factor, and what you feed yourself in any kind. So yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's
Crazy.
mind-boggling, but it all comes back to self-accountability, and yeah.
Well, on your point with the pharmaceutical industry, can I touch on that real quick? Because you're putting yourself in the shoes of how you would think an evil genius would behave. Like, it makes sense, right? Especially because they're free from any liability associated with vaccines, which is the product that is alleged to treat or to create immunity to, quote, viral illnesses, that you would be able to just induce never-ending profits, especially if you have the government in your back pocket to usher in legislation that matches whatever you want, and then you have the media in your back pocket. So a lot of people don't realize this. The 3 of the last 4 commissioners of the FDA either previously or now currently worked for pharmaceutical companies. One example, this one's really interesting because it relates to Pfizer, Scott Gottlieb. Scott Gottlieb was the commissioner of the FDA from 2017 through 2019. Scott Gottlieb, while commissioner of the FDA, I want you to listen closely on this. While commissioner of the FDA, one of the things that he did was expedite the approval process for experimental drugs. Meaning he expedited, pharmaceutical companies present some experimental drug that they have, and it's usually a slow process to approve it. But he helped to usher in new policies to expedite the approval process of experimental drugs. And that was 2017 through 2019 while he was commissioner of the FDA. Scott Gottlieb leaves the FDA. Where does he go? Joins Pfizer's board of directors. What happens at Pfizer? Expedited approval of an experimental vaccine. Right after he was commissioner of the FDA 2017 through 2019, just before COVID conveniently, leaves the FDA, joins Pfizer's board of directors, and then Pfizer has an experimental vaccine expedited in its approval process. Isn't that weird? But it's not like we know it's become so obvious at this point
It's
that
like a circus.
it's a circus, man. It's a total circus.
I know, it makes you wonder if they
Yeah.
overreached.
Yeah, I really think they did, because there are so many people waking up, and this is where I want to encourage people to go a layer deeper and question this idea that viruses even exist, especially because, understandably, especially as you're waking up, a lot of people are caught up with this idea that they created a virus in a lab, right? A lot of people are caught up with that idea, gain of function, and there's a lot of large figures that are talking about it. And the reality is, and we cover this during a docuseries that I created called The End of COVID, where we go through every single thing that happened during the COVID era, point by point, and analyze it in depth. It's over 108 hours of educational material covering every single detail. And we have a session called The Gain of Function Narrative, where Doctors Mark and Sam Bailey, 2 medical doctors who are some of the most brilliant minds that I know out of New Zealand, analyze gain of function. And when you look at the experiments claiming to have conducted gain of function on a virus, you will find that it's just a carryover of that experiment that I described with, the monkey's kidney cell and all those things. They'll then take that mixture, that breakdown of decaying material, and then they'll conduct multiple pass-throughs with animal models where they'll, expose it to an animal. The animal does not get sick, but then they'll take up the nasal tissue, not even nasal secretion, nasal tissue of that ferret, grind it up, then inject it into another ferret. That ferret doesn't get sick. Then they'll take that nasal tissue, grind it up, and they'll keep doing this and doing this and doing this. And then one of the ferrets will get sick. And then they'll take the crude biological material, like fluids from that ferret, and sequence it, find a sequence that isn't identical to the original so-called, quote, viral sequence. And it's slightly different. And they'll say, we have just produced a more lethal, more deadly virus. That, in a nutshell, and that was a very brief summary, is gain-of-function experiments. But again, going back to, in order to conduct gain-of-function on something, you first need to establish that that thing actually exists. What we're talking about when we talk about gain-of-function viruses is akin to saying they're conducting gain-of-function on a unicorn with lasers for eyes. If I were to say that to you, you'd be like, what do you mean? Like, there's no such thing as unicorns with lasers for eyes. And it's like, no. They're taking unicorns with lasers for eyes, or they're taking unicorns from nature, and they're conducting gain-of-function on them and making them have lasers for eyes now. It's like, dude, no. Before you can say that they're adding lasers to eyes of unicorns that are naturally occurring, you first need to establish that unicorns themselves actually exist. So then people ask, like, what is happening in these gain-of-function labs? And I do think that virologists think that they are doing these things. The reality is, when it comes to virology, and this is the case with any field, when you look at doctors as an example, and you say, how could so many doctors be in on it? Because that's what a lot of people that are accepting of the mainstream narrative say. Are you saying all doctors are in on it? And the answer is no, absolutely not. No, not all doctors are in on it. They're misled through medical school to believe certain things about health. That's simply it. Likewise, scientists, molecular biologists, virologists are misled and are taught to accept this procedure to isolate viruses, and they're taught that it is a well-established fact. This is how we isolate viruses. We've been doing this since the 1950s. And we've already established that this is how we isolate viruses. So no, not all virologists are in on it, and they think that they are doing these things in this lab. But again, going back to, with emphasis, they have never been able to demonstrate that disease is even spread via the fluids of a sick person. And I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. David Martin, bow tie guy that's been on Plandemic. Okay, so a lot of people will reference quotes by him to lend credence to the idea that there's a virus being made in the lab. I'll send you the episode. Dr. David Martin came on my podcast. And if you listen to his various public statements, especially at the European Parliament, that video went pretty viral, where he was talking about gain-of-function experiments and UNC Chapel Hill, EcoHealth Alliance, and things like this. He never says virus isolated. He never says virus this, virus that. He says viral model. And for someone who is attuned to what I've discovered, you listen to what he's saying, you're like, I think he gets it. I think he knows. I think he knows the truth that there's actually no proof of viruses. And so I had him on my podcast, and I had to press him pretty hard. It took like 35 minutes for him to finally give me a clear answer. But I asked him directly multiple times, David, is there, through these gain-of-function experiments, are they producing a particle or a virus or something that is being transmitted from person to person? And he said, no, never has been, never will be. And then he said, gain-of-function is all to derive synthetic sequences for the shots, meaning that it's to derive sequences of RNA or DNA for the creation of the COVID vaccine. It has nothing whatsoever to do with creating an actual particle that is being passed from person to person. And the reason it's so important for us to dismantle this paradigm, this idea that they're creating viruses in a lab, is because I'll pose this to you. What sounds scarier? The idea that a virus jumped from a bat to a pangolin to a lady eating bat soup in a 1 in a gazillion natural chance, which is completely unproven, right? Or the idea that they're taking that naturally occurring thing and manipulating it in a lab and making it more lethal.
The Chinese.
Yeah, the Chinese, who like so many Americans are scared of. Which has more fear-based implications for the future?
The Chinese.
Yeah, the Chinese. Just the Chinese, plain and state. But you see my point, right? Which is why, like, much of the freedom space is justifiably opposing vaccines right at this point, which, awesome, they should be, because there's zero reason to ever receive any of them. But they need to take it a step deeper, because unwittingly, much of the freedom space is actually perpetuating this idea that they're creating a much more deadly, lethal thing that they're going to release on the population in the future, which induces a lot of fear. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there aren't scientists doing weird shit. God knows what. Who knows what they're spraying in the sky? You know what I mean? Like, who knows? But the point is that this idea perpetuates the germ paradigm, the idea that, oh shit, I need to hide from other people because they just announced on the news that there's this new virus that is being released on the population, this alternative media source. I am scared as shit now. That's what happens. And the reality is this paradigm is completely unproven. Now, could they possibly be weaponizing bacteria in a lab? Possibly. Again, is there any established proof of that? No. And again, refer back to the statement. There's no evidence that disease is spread via the fluid of a sick person. There's actually countless experimental attempts to take an isolated form of bacteria, even tetanus bacteria, and deliver it to a healthy person. And guess what happens?
Nothing.
Nothing. Exactly. Because bacteria proliferate at the site of illness. Because what does bacteria do in nature? If I were to shoot a squirrel in the woods or chop down a tree, what proliferates on that tree or that squirrel? Bacteria and fungi to help break down that squirrel and bring it back to the earth. Likewise, when we're sick, bacteria proliferates because it is there to help break down that decaying tissue and bring it back to the earth as part of the circle of life. And that's, why we have symptoms of illness. And it's akin to the firefighter at the scene of a fire. It's blaming the firefighters for the fire when the reality is the firefighters are there to clean up the fire. That's why. I just threw up all over you. You said so much there.
So are you saying that initially every so-called virus or illness is created by each individual out of a combination of environment, mind sickness, and just what you surround yourself with, and groups of people exposed to themselves to the same toxins, and then end up with the same result on paper?
Essentially, yes. And I would change the language a little bit because you said, are you saying that each virus is created by this? So it depends on what you mean by the word virus, because what the mainstream calls virus, they would say is an obligate intracellular parasite that consists of a protein coat, right? And, in this case, they call it this, quote, spike protein and a nucleic acid or RNA or DNA on the inside, right? That's what they say that a virus is. And it's replication competent, meaning that it replicates inside a host cell and then is excreted out of that host where it causes issues in another host. So that definition of a virus being created inside of us, no, absolutely not. But if we refer back to the experiments where they, quote, isolate viruses, and again, this is an assumption. We're assuming that what is done inside a cell culture where tissue has been excised or cut out of a complex biological, physical, chemical, emotional, spiritual being, electric being, and assuming that just a fraction of that being, when you manipulate it and do a bunch of stuff to it in a lab, represents what actually happens inside that being. So let's assume that that's true for a second. That's a big assumption. If a virus is anything at all, based on the evidence, it is the byproduct of cells that have been poisoned and starved. Because referring back to those experiments, after you have reduced the nutrient intake, thus starving the cell, you have added toxic antibiotics and antibiotics, so poisoned the cell. So after cells have been poisoned and starved, the cells break down. And again, virologists point to those particles and say those are viruses. So if anything, again, these are a lot of assumptions here. If anything, viruses are simply the byproduct of cells that have been poisoned, starved. And then you can add an element. And again, this is where you're not able to really get this effect. Add an element of fear, add an element of belief, add all these other things that we've talked about. Then to answer your question, in that case, yes, viruses are created by us. But again, with emphasis, that depends on what your definition of virus is. That doesn't mean that those things are going to then excrete out of me and cause illness in another person. It's simply that they are the breakdown, they are the byproduct of us experiencing illness. And they have no effect otherwise. Does that make sense?
Troy also told me that, we sometimes live with the virus or with parasites just along with each other, and it's not a problem. It's almost like bacteria. You need bacteria in your body to live. You can't get rid of it all. It doesn't work like that. It's like the yin and yang. he
Symbiotic
he
relationship.
said you live alongside. It's almost like herpes.
Hmm.
You always have it in you, kind of, but no outbreak until you get harmed. Your immune system gets harmed, and then you have it. Sometimes you just trigger it with your mind, really, right? It doesn't always have to be a skin to skin, or and there's a lot of these things where you run around with it almost, but it seems to harm some people and don't harm other people. And it's almost like he said, like something about like how you cannot like get all the toxins out of your body because there is some sort of like where you live with them, with the
Yeah.
parasite.
Well, again, I would reframe. I think Troy's absolutely onto something there. I would reframe what I describe as toxins in your last statement there, because I would not describe parasites, bacteria, fungi, or let's set aside viruses for a second because they're in a different category. But parasites, bacteria, fungi as toxins necessarily, because here's a perfect example. If I go to a humid forest and let's say I camp in that forest, there's mold everywhere in that forest. It's not presently causing symptoms of illness in me. It wouldn't cause symptoms. But we talk about mold sickness inside of our houses. What mold does is it feeds on decaying material, right? Like what we talked about earlier. And when you live inside a home that has a bunch of toxic glues and adhesives, drywall, which contains a lot of toxic materials, that mold, when it is consuming those materials, will leach it into the air. And so I don't think you're actually getting sick from mold. You're getting sick because you're in a toxic environment that has poor air quality, that has poor air circulation, that is stagnant, swampy, material sitting around. Does that make sense? So when it comes to parasites, even, and parasites is a pretty big catch-all term. Am I going to say that parasites don't cause issues? No, parasites can cause issues, but the deeper question is, why are the parasites there in the first place? Right? Like, what is it that is causing the parasites to be there? And there are some parasites that are known to consume heavy metals. So if you have a lot of heavy metals inside your body, you might have more parasites inside your body. And is it the parasite that's the issue, or is it the heavy metal? And my argument would be it's the heavy metal that's the issue, and the parasites are there to remediate the heavy metals. But people will blame the parasites. It's again an example of firefighters at the scene of a fire. Like if I was a little kid and this is a scenario that would not be a real world example, but let's say I live right next to a forest that's known to have forest fires a lot. And every time I wake up and I see these men in red suits that are there and I see a fire blazing, if I didn't know otherwise, I would look at the men in red suits and be like, oh my God,
They brought the
they
fire.
keep freaking bringing these fires here, right? It's the same thing with bacteria, same thing with parasites, same thing with fungi. And, I'm not going to say that they don't cause issues. An example is tetanus. Tetanus bacteria, again, in its isolated form, cannot cause illness in a healthy person. But tetanus bacteria, if it's feeding on toxic material, meaning that it is helping to remediate toxic, essentially toxic biological material, it can produce a byproduct through its digestive process that itself is toxic. But again, you have to go back to, is that the fault of the bacteria, or is the bacteria simply just there doing its job and you are a toxic motherfucker who's eating too much toxic shit that is then causing the bacteria to produce this byproduct that's toxic? Does that make sense? So I always go back to, like, what is it in my choices in my environment that is causing me to become ill? And that's where Troy is spot on, because you do live in a symbiotic relationship with parasites, bacteria, and fungi. Now, with viruses, I wouldn't say it's a symbiotic relationship because there's no evidence that they actually exist. But again, if you reframe the definition of virus to mean what is happening in culture, and then again applying that to the human body. Sorry, some of the hair from the table is getting on my face. But if you apply that to what's happening in the human body, then yes, we do live, quote, symbiotically with, quote, viruses, because our bodies, viruses again, are simply our body excreting toxic material after we've been poisoned, starved, malnourished, or in a heightened state of stress, or a unique combination of those things. It's a breakdown of dead and decaying cells. So it's a breakdown. It's us experiencing illness. And that's, if anything at all, what, quote, viruses are. They are not an obligate intracellular parasite that is replication competent that is causing illness in another person. Does that make sense?
Can you tell me the steps you guys took with your mom to get better?
Yeah. It was simple. And this is what was so shocking to me, man. This was like, I forgot to add another piece. Like she had multiple suicide attempts too, because she was in such a state of psychosis, especially just before 2016, roughly 2015, she started to realize that it was likely the psych drugs, like the psychotropic medications, the benzodiazepines and SSRIs that she was on, that was causing her to feel like this. So she cut cold turkey off them. And I don't know if you know how harmful it can be to your system to cut cold turkey off of psych medications. It can actually put you in a full-blown state of psychosis. It would be akin to taking someone who's on crystal meth and just cutting off their supply. Their body goes into, what's the word? You know what I'm talking about? It's
Shock?
Yeah, body goes into shock. But what's the word that I'm talking about? Withdrawal. Like withdrawal,
yes.
Essentially from it's the same thing when it comes to psychotropic medication. So my mom realized that, oh my God, these drugs are what's making me worse in around 2015. So she cut cold turkey off of them, and she started like full-blown states of psychosis. Like that's when her hallucinations got really bad. It was really fucked up and dark. I actually almost left West Point because of how sick my mom was, to go back home and take care of her. And of course, because we were still believing that the doctors knew best, we saw her in the state of psychosis and we're like, see, this is why you need to be back on the drugs. What the fuck are you doing? And then, 2016 comes around, Kelly Brogan, that whole situation that I described earlier. And all it was, and this is where it's so simple, was, again, tapering off or just staying off of the drugs that the doctors provided. It was learning to address and heal your trauma, like actually having to face those things that you've stuffed down and not cope with, psychotropic medications, or in some cases alcohol or pornography or any of the other things that people cope with to try to avoid feeling with their feelings, right? So sitting with their feelings, having to actually face them. And there's, various things that people can do. Emotional freedom technique, which is EFT tapping. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's tapping on different meridians to help release pent up emotional trauma that is stored in your body. There's a lot of somatic movement stuff that you can do, simple, just qigong, meditation, even tai chi, kundalini yoga. There's so many things that you can do to help just somatically release the trauma that is stored in our body. For her, it was working with someone who does emotional freedom technique to help begin to release the trauma. And then it was just a simple Whole30 diet, dude. Like, that's it. Just Whole30, and then spending more time in nature. And what showed,
Whole30?
Whole30 is like a more extreme form of paleo. So you know how like paleo diet, are you familiar with paleo diet?
Not exactly.
Okay. So paleo diet is essentially, I actually don't agree on this point, but it's the idea that our Paleolithic ancestors ate simply what they could find without having to like harvest and cultivate things, meaning that like you don't eat any grains, because grains are something that you would have had to cultivate, right? They're not like a naturally flourishing crop. Bananas, as an example, coconuts, various types of fruits and vegetables that are like abundant in nature are something that our ancestors would have eaten, our Paleolithic ancestors, as well as meat, right? So it's the idea that you're only supposed to eat meat, fruit, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. That's
Which
it.
is funny too, because you don't live where bananas grow, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I mean,
but so
you don't have a boat or a plane to bring them over.
Yeah, like if you live in Wisconsin, you're not gonna. But so
that's what she ate.
Yeah, so
is that different? How is that different to ancestral diet?
It's different in that the ancestral diet would say that our more recent ancestors, again, pre-modern era, meaning pre-modernized processed foods, also would have incorporated cheeses, raw milk, sourdough bread, sprouted grains, things like this, right? Which I personally now eat an ancestral diet. I originally started with paleo. And I will say this, when you're eating a conventional American diet, which is shit, which is horrible for you, as you know, when you drastically switch to something like a paleo diet, and again, Whole30 is a more extreme version of paleo. Let me make that point there real quick. So paleo is what I just described, but in paleo, you can kind of make concessions, I guess you could say, and you can you can make brownies as an example with like maple syrup, so syrup from like a maple tree, rather than like sugar, just like white sugar, or using other substances to still be able to make desserts. What Whole30 is it's like, no, fuck desserts. You don't have desserts at all. You're getting in the mindset of just eating whole nutrient-dense fruits. So just fruits, vegetables, and meat, essentially. No desserts, none of that stuff. So it's a more extreme version of paleo. And I'll speak to my wife's experience because that was much more drastic in my opinion. She was chronically inflamed, dude. And she was on multiple drugs, one of them being, oddly enough, hydroxychloroquine, that were just suppressing her symptoms, meaning suppressing her body's alert system, like, hey, you have something fucking wrong. You need to stop eating like shit. You need to start healing your trauma, all these things. And she was taking these drugs, and that drug would lead to side effects. So, of course, what did that mean? We go to the doctor. I'm like, oh, I'm having these side effects. Oh, here's another drug to cover that side effect. A few months later, I'm having like mental issues. Oh, okay, here's another drug to deal with that side effect. So my wife was on all these drugs, right? And then after we see my mom begin to heal, we tried the same approach with her. And again, in a matter of 3 to 4 months, we tapered her off all of her drugs, no longer on any of them, just by adopting a more natural approach to health, which again consisted of things like attempting to heal your trauma with emotional freedom technique and these other techniques, which for me, I do Qigong. Back then I did meditative reparenting, where you get in a meditative state. You go back to revisit in your mind some of these traumatic experiences that you've felt, and you step in as the parent that you would have needed at that time to say what you needed to hear to sort of reframe what happened in that experience to resolve the issue. But just simple things like this, and then spending more time in nature, moving our body more consistently. I was already a pretty athletic guy, so that wasn't anything new to me. But with my wife, it was doing all those things and eating a more natural diet, and then her symptoms resolved. And it was like, it's that fucking easy? Like, it's that simple? It was shocking, right? Like, you're an athlete, though, so it's like not news to you. Most athletes who are competitive, especially CrossFit athletes, take such good care of their bodies that this is like, yeah, no shit. This is exactly how health works. If you take care of your body, if you eat a nutrient-dense diet, if you are sweating a lot, you're going to be healthy. Like, it's a no-brainer for you, but for most people in this country, health has become so discombobulated, especially as the mainstream medical paradigm has no clue what health actually is. Like, if you were to ask any doctor, what's your definition of health? They would probably be like they wouldn't know what to say. Like, what is your definition of health, right? And I mean, in medical school, doctors get 24, if they're lucky, 48 hours total of education on nutrition. They don't know jack shit about nutrition. So again, what my wife and mom did was very simple. It wasn't anything crazy, but it was shocking to us because it was so counter what we were taught about health, and what we are taught brings health to human beings. And it just makes sense. It's how we're naturally supposed to be.
So nothing else?
No, nothing else really. No.
That's so funny because all of these things you cannot profit off. And like a lot of times, like you can say everybody's evil, but Americans want to make money. Everything is money driven, and so is the pharmaceutical and the food industry.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the sunlight, they cannot profit of the sun. They cannot profit of you grounding. They cannot really profit much of you exercising. Not as much as like giving you drugs.
No, I mean, like you have CrossFit gear right outside your house,
Yeah.
right? You have a whole platform and rubber plates and things like this. Like, yes, you had to buy those things originally, but no one's profiting off of you becoming extremely healthy.
Yeah, more the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're constantly training your mind, making yourself more stronger and like harder to break down, harder to kill, it's a problem for this whole industry. And Yeah, it's so funny when I wanted like a magic answer of like her doing like this thing I can sign up to, but the answer is always so simple,
Yeah.
especially with nutrition, especially with go outside, get yourself in, ground yourself, take your shoes off, leave your phone at home, eat some meat, you know, stop frying everything,
Yeah.
and sleep 8 hours, and get break a sweat, and you'll feel great every day. So
It's you're bringing up a good point that I see common in the holistic health space now, where people are obsessed with supplementation, are obsessed with these alternative therapies like methylene blue injections and vitamin injections. I'm not saying those don't have their place. They absolutely do. But before jumping to things like that, there are so many things that are totally free, just like you're describing, that you can check off your list first and do them consistently on a daily basis to see if it brings you results before jumping to all these things that you have to pay for. Just like you're saying, grounding, getting adequate sunlight, doing breath work, breathing, drinking water that is free of fluoride and free of other environmental toxins. Those are 4 things right there that, you may have to get a water filter, but you can get water if you use findaspring.com. In most locations, you can get spring water, and that's free. Those are 4 things right there that have a much, much, much better impact on your health than any of these things that you can pay for if you do them consistently. And they're completely free. And then, like you said, eating, adequate nutrition, eating very nutrient dense foods. For me, that looks like eating a lot of organ meats and eating a lot of just meat in general. Drinking a lot of raw milk for me personally, which, that's another thing we could talk about, the idea that milk is bad. But these are simple things that you can do that don't require you to go to a doctor, that require no one else, that will bring tremendous results to your health. And I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. And what was incredible is after seeing that very shocking experience with my wife and mom beginning to heal, my mom started sharing her story. My wife started connecting with other people. And we've now come across hundreds, if not thousands, of other people that we've talked to that have almost the exact same story. And it just shows how simple, consistent, day-to-day things that are mostly free with respect to health will bring you results that are far better than any doctor could bring you.
and people don't want to do that.
No.
They rather take vitamin D than go outside.
Yeah.
They rather get a $200 EPM mat than take their shoes off.
Yeah.
Because it's just so fancy. Even me, I catch myself on like wanting the $20,000 cold plunge than just getting it for free. But it is, all those things are for free, and
they have their place though, man. Getting a cold plunge, like
if you
that's
can
awesome.
afford it.
Like if you can afford it, but they have their place.
But
And
don't
again,
make the excuse.
exactly.
Like then just do the cold shower. But don't make the excuse that it's too expensive to do it.
Exactly.
But if you have the money,
yeah, if you have the money, go get
yeah.
a cold plunge because it is convenient.
Yeah.
But there is no reason to make any excuses for any of those things I just mentioned. Anyone can go spend 10, 15 minutes a day and just focus on deep breathing. And that will bring tremendous results to your health if you do that consistently. Anyone can move their body. Even if you don't have any weights, your excuse is you don't have, the ability to afford a gym membership. Can you get up and do body weight movements? There are so many free body weight workouts that are available all over the internet. Yeah. It's just excuses. There's no excuse. And I think a lot of it boils down to people are pussies. People have become soft pussies. People have excuses for everything. People want to blame something outside of them for their issues. Even a lot of people in the freedom space will blame what the government is doing. And don't get me wrong, the government's doing a lot of fucked up shit, but you're aware of it now. We're aware of it now. What the fuck are we going to do about it? You know about it. So what are you going to do? Because you can take the steps in your day-to-day life to ensure that the government has no impact on you, which again, just consists of men and women just like us. They're just men and women. We look at them like they're some big, scary monster. They're literally comprised of men and women. Maybe, David Icke is right, and maybe they're reptilians or some shit. But you get what I'm saying, though. Like, they're just people like us. They're just people. And we're coming up with all these excuses of they did this, they did that, they're doing this to us. And yes, don't get me wrong, there are people trying to do these things. One of my friends, Greg Paul, had one of the best quotes ever. He said, "I am not saying there is not a wild gang of nefarious actors who are wholly set upon preying on our unconscious decisions and behaviors. But they are our unconscious decisions and behaviors. That's what it is. Likewise, they are our excuses. Just like you said, you don't have money for a cold plunge, take a cold shower. You don't have, you can't afford to go to a gym. You can't afford to buy gym equipment. Good. Do body weight workouts. Run, walk, something. Do something. You don't have enough money to, get a really fancy water filter. Okay, you can go find a spring near you. Or you can still drink water that is better than fluoridated water. Find water that is relatively cheap that you can afford. You don't have money to buy all these organ meat supplements. Go find a farmer near you and just buy some meat and eat less. You don't need to eat as much as you think you absolutely do, unless you're training as a professional athlete. You're in a different case. But the point is, most people are eating way more than they actually need to. There are so many excuses that people are making to prevent themselves from being healthy. And it all comes back down to our individual choices.
What about your children? Because I kind of like moved to Texas because in California, if you want to go to school, you will have to jab them up.
Yep, got to get the
96 times under the age of 10, I think, is the number right now.
Mm-hmm.
And they just came out with a new one, the RSV.
Yep.
And I went to, this was the last thing I did in California. I went to the pediatrician and she said, man, this one, it's so safe. This one is really safe. And my wife should get it while she's still pregnant because then the baby's going to get the antibodies. And I was like, we were both laughing and we didn't even say anything because at this point, she's not evil. This is a nice pediatrician. She's a nice lady. She's just so in it that admitting that she is harming baby after baby after years and years of jabbing babies up every month, every week, maybe every day. I mean, you kill yourself.
Oh, man.
On the spot. Like, if she would admit to that, open her eyes to that, that is the end. Because she loves children. She thinks she's doing that but it's out of control, the whole system. So it becomes crazy, I think. And then also when I look at everything that's going on right now, I feel like a lot of these decisions come from people. I think it comes down to pro-human versus the globalists, how Elon always puts it. It's people that are for humans and people that are against humans. It's as simple as that. And if you listen to anyone, are they saying more humans or less humans? It's you can categorize really easy. Like Bill Gates wants to like get less humans because we're all bad footprint and all this shit. And then you have people like Elon who say make more children because otherwise everything's gonna collapse. So, and then it comes back to the isolation. Like, do people not talk to each other, or do you want to keep them as separate as possible? Give everyone their Netflix, and you don't even say hi to your neighbors. So the less you talk to each other, the more control, because the more you will educate yourself from the device that we give you, that we control, that we pay the advertisers to, that 90% goes back to the pharma. So we will control exactly what you're eating mentally. So we will control the narrative and we will spin it however way we want it, as long as you don't talk to your neighbor because he has maybe a virus. Right?
Yeah, he has maybe a virus.
So it really comes down to pro-human versus the end, or however way they want to go, which is very scary.
Yeah. I'll speak on, so you asked about my kids, and
I mean, what I wanted to say is that there comes a lot of decisions from people that don't have kids, who don't think about these things out of a perspective of a father or a mother, where you maybe be okay with, this is what this room a little bit represents, because I used to think this is the middle finger to society because I dress the fuck I want, until I found out they give you this freedom to get you completely confused that you think you're free, but you're actually harming yourself on a daily basis. This is what the LGB is getting used for, they are being actors and they don't even know it.
No.
They're standing for freedom, but they're still eating the bugs and harming themselves, being fat, obese, sexualized, porn. It's all like the you're harming yourself and everybody around you in a false thing. It's almost like the jabber of the doctor. You think you're doing the right thing. It is a little bit of freedom if you can run around in a G-string, but also you don't have it in every part of your life. You're getting you're
Manipulated.
completely confused.
Yeah, totally confused. And to touch on the point that you made with respect to a doctor, right? I've thought the exact same thing when it comes to some of my friends. You know, like I was in the U.S. Army, and luckily I've never deployed, never been in combat. But I have several friends who have, and I have friends who've flown Apache helicopter missions and killed hundreds of people. And when, you know, I share my perceptions of the government and the necessity of the wars that we've been involved in, namely Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, wars in the Middle East, which were, as I've come to understand them, completely based on false pretenses. There's no reason for us to ever be there. Having to wrestle with that reality for my friends who've flown Apache helicopter missions, that's a lot. Like, I can't imagine the cognitive dissonance, just like doctors having to realize that they have been unwittingly poisoning children, sometimes causing, I wouldn't say permanent in every case, but in many cases, what would be considered permanent neurological issues, permanent behavioral issues, and sometimes causing death. That's a lot to sit with. And that's where it's important for those of us in the freedom movement to have compassion for people who are still so blinded, because at one point in time we were blinded too. And most of us had some sort of experience, or maybe just had the wherewithal to understand that this system is not producing genuine health and freedom. And that's where I think it's important that we have compassion for those who still can't see, while, again, at the same time, not stifling our own voices and not mincing words, speaking truth boldly, speaking our perceptions boldly, but still having compassion for those that can't see. And it's a delicate balance on those two things. Now, to answer your question with what we do with our kids is, so my first, both of my kids are, let's just say, poison-free, completely poison-free. And my son was born in a hospital. It was a pretty traumatic birthing experience for my wife because we didn't know what we know now. She had an ultrasound every week because she was, quote, high risk, because she had just resolved lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. Because she was previously diagnosed with that, they're like, oh, you're a high risk pregnancy. So we had to get an ultrasound every week, so my son was exposed to insane amounts of radiation on a weekly basis. And then she was, quote, strep B positive. So she was given a shit ton of antibiotics, which ruined her gut microbiome, which then my son was a C-section birth. So he didn't get that initial vestibular input and initial gut flora or initial flora bacterial exchange from my wife.
And
so
the glandular,
the what?
The Troy says that when you get squeezed,
yeah,
you get the
input originally.
Yeah, it's almost like a crazy LSD experience,
Yeah.
because you get squeezed.
Oh, on your third eye.
Yeah, your third eye gets squeezed, and the baby it gets not only exposed to the bacteria of the vaginal canal, which boosts your immune system, but also your, what's it called, the neutral something glands get squeezed.
Pineal gland.
And you have like DMT.
Yeah.
Burst out in the baby.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's really cool though. That makes sense too.
Yeah. You take that away from the baby too.
Yeah.
And C-section is like the new favorite thing.
Dude.
To not only take away the birthright of the women and put it in the hospital hands, but just to already ruin where you start off as with step one, kind of like to have you like not pre-dead, but like pre-harmed.
Totally.
So you never recover from that first initial. And then, I mean, RFK Jr. goes into this much more, but the Hep B was
the time
created
of birth
for prostitutes and gay people that have a lot of sex and they had just way too much of it, so they just said like, let's give it to babies.
Yeah, which is absurd. It makes
Yeah.
zero sense on the first day of birth,
Mhm.
right? Like it makes zero sense for a number of reasons, but especially like considering all the factors at play. Like a baby is born into this world and is perfectly healthy immune system that was created by God, and the first thing you do is you stab it with vitamin K and also Hep B. It makes zero sense whatsoever. But to your point on C-sections, a good friend of mine, Ayla Cuenca, she's a doula. She has a friend who is a midwife who only does natural births, home births typically. And she has overseen over 1,000 natural births. Only 8 of those over 1,000 natural births have ended up in C-section. Some hospital systems have upwards of 50, 60, 70% C-section rates. It's absurd. And
Money machine.
it's a money machine, exactly, because then they can count it as a surgery, and then
Yeah.
insurance companies are going to pay them out.
And you have to stay more nights.
Yeah.
It's everything gets added up, and it's just much more money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we stayed, I think, 3 nights in the hospital after my son's birth. But so that was my son's birth experience, and then we, after the fact, woke up to the reality of the birthing system. And my daughter, at 26 weeks, we were seeing a traditional OBGYN up until that point. And my wife kept reiterating, hey, I really want to try for a VBAC, which is a vaginal birth after a C-section. So second child, you want to try for just a normal vaginal birth after you've just had a C-section. And the OBGYN, again, very nice, well-intentioned lady, was like, statistically speaking, it's probably not going to be likely, especially with your hips aren't really wide enough. Your son has a really fucking big head. So probably not going to be likely. I think we'll try for it, but statistically speaking, it's probably not going to happen. And you're also high risk, quote. Again, this is a few years later. My wife has no symptoms of lupus rheumatoid arthritis, but they still consider her high risk because she previously had it, which is just nonsense. But my wife and I sat and talked after that appointment because she was really discouraged. She's like, I really want to have a vaginal birth. Like, I really want this. And I kind of want to do it in a bathtub. We're like, well, let's try for a natural birth. So we called that OBGYN. We said, hey, we're not seeing you anymore. We're going to go see this midwife at this birthing center, which is literally just a house. It's like a house with a bathtub, right? And at 38 weeks, so 12 weeks afterwards, we get a call from that OBGYN office, and the doctor's on the phone, and it's a man this time. And he's like, you need to be induced. This is going to be potentially catastrophic if you try to do this naturally. You're high risk. You need to be induced. Statistically speaking, this is not going to happen for you. You're making a horrible decision. So my wife, again, freaked out because we still have a little bit of the conditioning that says, oh, the doctor knows best. Maybe we need to listen to him. And she's 38 weeks pregnant. She's like, shit, maybe he's right. Maybe this is wrong. And we sat with it for a second. We worked through those emotions, and we were like, no, people have been fucking giving sorry,
Only
not people,
because
women.
of you. If you're not in the picture, a woman is easily emotionally
Manipulated.
persuaded.
Yeah.
And she, being this pregnant and being more on the emotional side, naturally, she will listen to a man telling her it's going to be catastrophic on the phone. There's
Exactly.
no other way. There's no way she's not like, okay, maybe I don't know what I'm doing, right?
Yeah, so maybe I don't want to toot my own horn a little bit, but maybe like for real though, me being there and being like, no, fuck what that guy says. Like we're good. You're
Because you're
totally
rational.
fine. Yeah. And totally true. Like when a woman's pregnant, she's in a very emotional and vulnerable state, fragile. Absolutely. Understandably too. And so fast forward now to the day that she goes into labor, and it's actually pretty, I think like a week after her quote due date. So you would be considered like, traditional system would be like, oh, you need to be induced. You're past your due date now. This is bad. Such bullshit. And so my wife delivered our second baby in a bathtub. My wife gave birth. My wife it was the most empowering thing to witness, especially after her first experience, after having all these doctors say, this is catastrophic, blah, blah, blah. My daughter came out. My wife picked her up out of the water herself and held her, and then looked at me and goes, I did it. It was just like, fuck yeah, you did it. And it was such a beautiful experience. And seeing the contrast of birth in the hospital system under fluorescent lights, it's cold, everything's white and sterile. The nurses hate their fucking job. They're screaming at you. Literally, one of the nurses cussed my wife out after her epidural because she was in pain and said, "You will not be like this in my operating room." And we're like, what the fuck? We're supposed to be giving birth. And then the second experience, we're in a house that has candles lit everywhere. And it was such a contrast because we felt held, we felt warmth. It felt very intentional and almost like ceremonial in a way, and almost psychedelic in a way. It was an incredible experience. And then being able to immediately just lay there and hold our daughter while the umbilical cord is still connected, and just laying there and looking, like making eye contact with each other, making eye contact with our daughter, like, well, I guess her eyes hadn't opened at that point, but the point is just like staring at our daughter. And it was such a beautiful experience. And that is how birth is supposed to be. And people have been conditioned to believe it's this scary thing, especially like movies talk about indoctrination, how Hollywood indoctrinates us. How many movie scenes have we seen where like a wife is like screaming, ah, and then the wife ends up dying or the baby dies? So it reinforces this idea that birth is something to be scared of, that birth is a medical procedure that only the doctors know best, and you need to be under well-cared doctors. And don't get me wrong, they have their place. The example, like those that midwife who'd overseen over 1,000 natural births, 8 of them did end up in C-section. So that is there if it's needed in an emergency situation. But the overwhelming majority of C-sections are completely unnecessary. And they're causing all these complications, just like you mentioned, with respect to the baby not getting the initial gut or the initial bacterial input, the initial vestibular input, the initial psychedelic experience that I didn't know that. That's so cool. But birth really is an incredible experience. So anyway, all that to say, both of my kids never been poisoned, let's say, and they're both healthy and thriving, man. Like my son does have some a little bit of emotional dysregulation issues, but and we're working through those, and he's completely awesome. But we attribute that to all those other things that happened that my daughter did not experience, because my daughter's experience was like as natural as it can possibly get. And we see the difference in the two, and they're both incredible kids. And speaking specifically to people in California real quick. So for the people who do choose to stay in California, which, like, God bless you for choosing to stay there, if you do, they, SB 276 and SB 277, which require vaccines in order to go to public school. My answer to that is fuck public school. Shouldn't be in public school anyway. Public school is indoctrinating your kids. Go find alternative schools. And of course, they're going to try to come for those who homeschool and go to alternative schools. And a lot of the alternative schools in California are fucked up. But the point is, you don't want to send your kids to public school anywhere anyway, because you're just being indoctrinated to be an obedient slave to the U.S. government. This is expressly stated. The Western education system, the public education system, is based in the Prussian education model. And the Prussian education model was expressed to create men and women that would be obedient to the government. That's not even a conspiracy theory. Like, that is, you can easily find information on that. And that is what our school system is based off of in the United States and most likely other Western countries. So in public school systems, you're just being indoctrinated to blindly accept what authority says. You're being taught to regurgitate exactly what the teachers know. The teachers in the textbooks know best, don't question it. You are graded on your ability to regurgitate and memorize what they are telling you, rather than cultivating critical thinking, cultivating questioning, cultivating a sense of, what am I actually passionate about? When's the last time you used the fucking Pythagorean theorem?
Nothing I ever learned in school I use on anything.
Exactly. That's my point, man. So that's my response to the people who do choose to stay in California and are scared about the school thing. I understand. And like, it may be time for you to leave California and do what Ken has done and come to Texas. Like, Texas is pretty fucking rad. And my son does go to an alternative school here. There's a few of them across the Austin area called Acton Academy. And there's actually a few of them across the United States. And it's an alternative school that is based in contract and common law. What I mean by that is, before the kids go into their pod, They don't call them classrooms. Go into their pod or their Spark. Sometimes they call that act, and they have to sign a contract that they agree with all the terms. So it's teaching you to understand that everything in your life is contractual. Like, you are the one making the choices to do this. You are the one opting in or saying no. And it's all based on question asking. So the teachers aren't called teachers, they're called guides. And they ask questions to the kids. And when the kids give a response, they then ask another question. Rather than authoritatively saying, this is how it is, they help inspire curiosity within the kids for the kids to question and come to the answer on their own terms, right? And then they don't have these arbitrary standards where you're in first grade, first grade, you must learn this, second grade, you must learn this. None of that stuff. And it's really beautiful because it's all based on self-directed learning where they help guide kids to what they naturally are flourishing in. As an example, prior to us sending our son to this school, we were already doing what's called self-directed learning at home, where we weren't enforcing these arbitrary standards that you need to meet this at this age, you need to be doing this at this age. And my son is, I would say, relative to what the standard is that's set forth by the government, is right on par with when it comes to math and then also writing. But when it comes to reading, my son is reading at like a 9 or 10-year-old level as a 6-year-old. And it's because he naturally just loved reading and wanted to read on his own and taught himself how to read. And we didn't say, you must do this. And once we saw that he liked reading, we helped cultivate more reading. And he is like obsessed with reading. That's one of his favorite things to do. And just shows that when you're not authoritatively enforcing, saying you must do this, you must fit this box, you must fit this mold, you must learn this bullshit thing that you're not going to use later on in life, kids actually love to learn. They love to be creative. And that's what we're witnessing in my son, and countless other people have witnessed in their kids when it comes to education. Like, education can be a fun thing. It's not forcing arbitrary standards that are created by the government that just wants to indoctrinate you to be an obedient slave, and actually helping to cultivate an environment where the kids are inspired to do what they love to do, which will naturally lead to them being productive members of society and having a fruitful life.
What about exposing them to technology? Because I'm like, my son is 2.5, right? So I have some time to think all this shit through. What obviously you start with is, because it's the first thing that happens, is the vaccinations, where you have to like take a step back and do your research. Next comes the breast milk decision, right? Formula or breast milk, also very interesting to look into. Next thing comes nutrition, and then after that, education. So you go like through a step, like you get forced to think everything through, even for yourself. I think you learn so much, even for your own body, when you are responsible now for another body, which you might have been very irresponsible with yourself until to that point, where you have to be forced to be responsible for somebody. And I think that's what's missing. And that's why people like Elon say you gotta have more babies and you gotta make more babies, because it really teaches you how to be better to yourself, better to your community, better to your wife. I mean, really everything. It all comes back together, kind of like you learn as much as you give, as much as you think you teach your kid, kid teaches you back. And it really makes me wonder, makes so much sense why they would make us as, like, give them screens where they can jerk off to a screen at all times, right? Give them fabrics that make them as non-sexual as much as possible, right? Get the sex drive, the hormones, everything down as much as possible. No sunlight, so you become this like just like blob that doesn't want to procreate. And let's give them the freedom of like gendering themselves as much as they want, because there's nothing more unattractive than being either female or male. You're just on the spectrum, is what they call it, which is just a very being unattractive. There's nothing more attractive than being female or male, and especially because that is the magnets, the two sides, the yin and yang, that attracts each other. So when you're in between, then you might just be asexual, and that's the perfect spot to have as least humans as possible. and this is where it's all heading, I feel like.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you just said there. And to answer your question, when it comes to technology with kids, it is a tough one, man.
Right.
Like, it's tough. Like,
Like,
especially
you
like,
can't pretend that you live like in the woods and it doesn't exist.
yeah.
Kind of, right?
I mean, you
Like,
can, especially if like, we're pretty similar in that we use technology for a piece or in whole our income and like what we do in the world to educate people. So we can't say that technology is purely bad because we're using it and we're using it in a positive way ourselves, right? So that's where it's important to cultivate a responsible way to use technology. So when we're at restaurants, absolutely not, never. We don't allow them to use technology. When we're on long road trips for like 8 to 10 hours or something like that, which we've done pretty frequently. My dad lives in Colorado, so we go visit him a lot. We have family in Kansas City that we go visit. And those are long car rides, man, sometimes multi-day car rides. We try as long as we can to have them do activities. My wife always buys a bunch of coloring books and things like this. And then after some time, we're like, okay, you can watch a movie. But we're very...
what kind of movie?
Exactly. This is the thing. We're very vigilant about
And
what
what kind of restaurants do you go to?
So there's actually some pretty amazing restaurants in Austin. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but there's this one that we eat at all the time called Picnic that doesn't use any seed oils, that gets grass-fed beef for all their meat.
That gets tricky too.
The
The more you get into it, the more I'm like, I don't want to listen to music anymore.
I know.
I don't want to watch Hollywood anymore. But I can also not watch a documentary every night. I'm like, like feeding your brain with this, and then you can't sleep. Sometimes
Yeah,
you
man.
need something idiotic.
Yeah,
to
you need
calm
to-
your system,
exactly,
right? Because my
exactly.
wife is like, come on, like, do you really need to listen to a podcast right now? Like,
That's
let's just watch some dumb shit. And I'm like, okay, as long as we're aware that this is some dumb shit,
yeah.
it's okay.
Totally, man. Like, I mean, even, sometimes my wife and I will just like, before we get into bed, we'll like sit and look at funny ass reels. Like, it's okay to do that sometimes. It's no different than watching like a comedy special back in the day, or just like doing some, I don't know, random ass activity that people used to do before they had TVs, or playing a sport or something like that. It's a fun, leisurely activity that people used to do, or watch sports. But there is balance when it comes to all that stuff, obviously. And when it comes to kids, when talking about what movies are you allowing them to watch, or what restaurants do we go to. So when it comes to movies, we make a point to watch the movies with them very intently if it's a new one. And if we see some form of indoctrination, we turn it off and we just explain to them. We don't treat them like they're idiots. We say, hey, this movie has some stuff in it that's just probably not good for you because it's going to feed you ideas. We explain that to them, in a very simple, easy to understand way, but we don't talk to them like they're less than. We just say, hey, this is probably not good for you to watch. We help them understand from within why it's not good for them to watch those things. Like, it's hilarious when we go to activities with other families present who don't feed their kids the way we feed our kids. You can tell that my son has come to understand on his own the problems with normal foods, because his first answer, or his first question when someone tries to offer him a treat or something, is this organic? And then he'll say, is this gluten-free? Is this sprayed with glyphosate? He'll ask those questions as a 6-year-old. And the other piece to this is, though, specifically speaking to food, is that when my wife was on her healing journey, we were so strict. And of course, that meant that, we can't eat anywhere. Look at the ingredients in all these places. But we've come to understand now that it's just as toxic, if not more toxic to health, again, going back to mindset and belief, to be so strict when it comes to health. Again, there's ebbs and flows. Like, if you're in a phase and you have specific goals that you want to meet for your fitness or nutrition, be restrictive, be extremely restrictive. You should be, and you should be disciplined. But outside of those periods, it's okay to experience life sometimes and get a fucking pizza. Are you going to feel the negative effects of it? Especially if you eat consistently healthy? Yeah, you're going to feel like shit afterwards. But when we're at home, we eat as close to natural and as clean as we possibly can. But like I said, when I went to Hawaii, we had a little bit to drink and we ate food because we're experiencing Hawaii. Did I eat a lot of raw fruit? Hell yeah, I did. So I was trying to eat as healthy as I could. But then we still went out to restaurants and stuff because we're in a place that we typically don't go. And we don't want to, we want to live life, dude. but I'm now paying the price because I have sinus issues and stuff. My skin was breaking out a little bit, and that's stuff that typically doesn't happen to me. But we've come to understand that it's just as toxic to our psyche to be so restrictive that you're shaming yourself every time you do something wrong, or you are, so afraid of eating at other people's houses. It's like, fuck, how am I going to be social at all if
Yeah.
unfortunately, most people aren't on the same page, which is why it's so important to be doing stuff like you and I do so that we can get more people on the same page, because we know that the government is not going to change things around. That's just the reality. Like they're going to put someone in office who is going to toe the line, and that's just how it's going to be, especially at this point, especially after what we saw with 2020. And I also question every election before that, but that's just me personally. But the point is, we can change things around by spending money on things that actually help bring in a new paradigm for society, like making a point to overwhelmingly when we go out, when we go to Austin as an example, we go to picnic. We spend our money at places that when we're in our local area produce food and put food on the plate that is not toxic to our bodies. Do we still, like I said, have pizzas and stuff like that? Sometimes we do. But the more we make the decisions to spend our money in places that are help driving things that we want to see happening in the world and educate other people to do the same, the more that the cultural shift. It's almost becoming a fad now and everyone talks about it, even in the mainstream, to do breath work or intermittent fasting, right? Like
Cold lunch.
or cold plunge, right? Exactly. And that's because of people like you, people like me, helping to educate people, and then also putting our money where our mouth is and doing those things consistently, right?
Yeah.
And that's what helps turn the tide to where we don't have to be as worried about going out, because it's like, holy shit, none of these places are doing seed oils now because people stopped spending as much money at those places and people started spending more money here. Those companies would then be forced to change, forced to adopt a new way of being. And there's actually a pretty amazing app for that is pretty common in the Austin area called Seed Oil Scout. I don't know if you've heard of it. You can find restaurants near you that don't use seed oils. And it's not that seed oils are the only bad thing. It's one of very bad thing though. And you can find restaurants near you that don't use seed oils, which is pretty rad. So that's Seed Oil Scout. But yeah, so that's what we do with our kids.
I like that because sometimes it goes like it's like far left and far right. You can take it so far that you live with in constant fear of somebody poisoning you. And that's like, I think in the beginning when I woke up, which like irritated me, is that people take it to a spectrum where I'm like, you just don't want to hear it. When they're like, they don't shower with the shower head, they have like a filter system. Like, so I had these neighbors that first woke me up, and I remember it was just like, you kind of reject it because first of all, it's so hard to like admit all the toxic shit that you're doing, right? That's like step number one, is just
acceptance
super
is step
hard.
number one.
But then the other one is that people take it so far, it's like a whole living. It becomes their identity. It's like being gay. Like you're more than just your sexuality. Like this is not who you are.
Yeah.
This is just a little tiny part.
Yeah.
You know, like me being straight is a tiny part of me. It's not that important.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have to tell everybody constantly my sexuality, right? I don't meet you and I'm like, hey, I'm so straight.
Wearing a shirt,
today,
stickers on everything.
Today I feel extra straight.
Yeah.
I feel so fucking straight. No. Same with the health thing. Like there's more than just the government pumping us up with medals. Like you can do more than that. It doesn't have to be your full everything you do.
Yeah.
And I like what you said, because also the healthier you are, the more you get away with things. It's like an athlete can eat shit sometimes.
Yeah, man.
Not always, but you get away with stuff. Because I've been so dialed in for so long. I can eat shit. I can eat ice cream at night. I can go and eat fries.
Yeah.
It doesn't harm me, but how much do I really do it? Like it's like a couple percentage of all the organs that I usually eat, you know? So I think that's you need to not drive yourself crazy, even with the health aspect, because it becomes like me, like, because I did get the COVID jab and I could drive myself crazy over that and ask 1,000 people and nobody really knows what to do and how to get it out. Or I can just be like, what can I do today to be my healthiest version? And, you know, in the end, nobody knows what it's going to do. And also it might be just me really different to maybe somebody who is obese or old or not in the right mindset.
Can I comment on that real
Uh-huh.
quick, actually? Because you bring up such an important point, man. So, do I acknowledge that the shot, and all shots really? I actually had a tweet about this the other day. I want to say that yes, the COVID jab is toxic, and there's no reason to ever receive it. And you know that now, obviously, but there is so much emphasis on the COVID jab to where there are some people who are subtly or directly, who are like, quote, health freedom leaders, carrying this idea that like, oh, that jab is extremely bad, which creates the impression that the other ones are good, which is nonsense. The other ones are toxic as shit too, and there's no reason to ever receive them. But here's the important point. I remember back in 2021, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, I think it was, who I respect for her work, especially with respect to educating for vaccines, made a claim, something to the effect of, if I remember correctly, 60 million people are going to die from these jabs. I remember being so pissed off at that claim. Here's why. There's so many people in the alternative health space who have recovered their kids from vaccine injury, have recovered themselves from vaccine injury, have received vaccines themselves, and carry the idea, which I completely agree with, that the body is self-healing, self-regenerating, and your ability to express health is directly related to your daily habits, and that you can detoxify and shift yourself out of any bad situation, which I completely agree with. And they'll say that in one breath. And then somehow when it comes to these shots, which again are poisonous and completely ineffective, and there's zero reason to receive them for all the reasons that we talked about during this, they'll say, oh, you received that? You've permanently altered your genome. You're going to fuck that, dude. Zero evidence that it permanently alters your genome.
But how many people do you have that are like, I do feel a little tired?
Yeah, I mean,
did you remember the long-term COVID?
Yeah,
thing?
long COVID, I think, is
I'm
simply
like,
just
shut
jabbing.
the fuck up, and like, what are you talking? Like, people are like, yeah, I'm just more weak than usual.
Yeah.
What the fuck are you saying, bro? Just go and run, or like, what are you like? Every time I'm tired at the gym, I'm like, you make energy.
Yeah.
People don't get that. Don't work out. You need to work out to know what we're talking about,
100%.
because like, where does the energy come from? I cannot eat, not sleep, still go to the gym, and you pull it out of your ass. It's insane. It's like how David Goggins says, you will find out when you're determined to get something done, you pull it out of somewhere.
100%.
You make energy.
How bad do you want it?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And like, it's the same thing. How bad do you want to fucking heal? Like, that's the thing. And that's why I appreciate about your perfect example of that. You're doing things on a day-to-day basis that help bring your body into a peak level of health. And you understand, yeah, I fucked up and I received that thing. I didn't know better at the time, but it doesn't fucking matter. And that's where like I get so frustrated. It's a delicate balance, right? Because it is important to educate on the harms of vaccines. It's important to educate on there's no need to ever receive them, which is why I'm so big on championing the falsification of the germ hypothesis, telling people that you don't need to receive any of those products anyway, because there's no reason to, because the entire foundation that necessitates these products allegedly is completely pseudoscientific and unproven, right? Like, that's why I'm so big on stressing that, because when it's a balance of educating on the harms of the products, but also helping more importantly, and most importantly, in my opinion, on educating on the healing capacity, the innate healing capacity and intelligence of the human body, especially if you shift your mindset and your beliefs and your thoughts around an outcome. So when people who've received the shot and realize they fucked up, are being fed information like, oh, you fucked up. You have tainted blood now. And fuck that shit, dude. I'm sorry. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it. Could you maybe have tainted blood for some time? Possibly, but you can detoxify from fucking anything. And that goes back to the most important thing is the body is a self-healing, self-regenerating, beautifully brilliant, intelligent creation from the divine. And if we put our minds to something, we can achieve peak health, especially if we step out of perpetual fear, which again, if you understand that piece and you educate people on that, on how brilliant their body is, it negates the need to ever receive any of the shots in the first place. Because when you help people understand, even people who are super pro-vaccine, like, look, dude, you don't need any of that stuff. You have all that you need within you to heal. You don't need to pay anyone. You don't even need to listen to me. You need to start listening to yourself and start doing what nature, start going with what nature provides, and you can be healthy. It's all within you. Empowering them to understand that, they'll come to it on their own terms. Like, fuck, I don't need any of those products anyway. That's a better way to educate people on vaccines than saying, "Oh, if you receive those, you're fucked. You're gonna die." It's bullshit. It's absolutely not true.
No, and you're doing the same thing over again.
Yes,
You're going
exactly.
from one victimization to the next.
Exactly.
You're like, oh, now, oh no, now I did it. Now, oh no, like you. It's always the now you have enemy. You know, before it was the virus. Now it is the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
So as long as it's not me being responsible for myself, I win.
Yeah.
My ego wins because I am harmed. So that's why I'm always tired. Like, I don't have to be good anymore. I don't have to provide, protect, or be a strong human because I am harmed. Somebody harmed me. The system harmed me. I am a victim of the system. I'm full of metal and I'm
That's
just
it.
weak.
I'm fucked.
I'm
Yeah,
fucked.
nothing I can do. And again, this is where it's a delicate balance of, that relates to what we were talking about earlier with trauma, to acknowledging what you experienced, acknowledging that, yeah, my unconscious behaviors and my lack of understanding did lead me to make these decisions that led to me receiving these products or being poisoned or this or that. Yes, that happened. Okay. What the fuck are you going to do about it now? And it's the understanding that there is no one coming to save you. There are people who may help you along the way, provide educational material. You may want to go see a functional medicine doctor or someone like that for some time. Of course, they have their place, right? But there is no one that is going to do the work for you. And that's the problem with American culture in general, maybe Western culture. I don't know if it's the same in Austria, but I would assume so. It's probably more prevalent in America, is that everyone's looking for a fucking handout. Everyone's looking for someone else to come do the work for them when it requires you to do the consistent things on a day-to-day basis to bring yourself to heal. And that's what I witnessed in real time with my own wife, her consistently doing the things on a day-to-day basis to heal. And she did. And she drastically healed, defying what doctors had told her she'd never heal from for her whole life.
And that's the problem, what they're pushing with the whole propaganda. That's the problem with Netflix, the music industry, the LGBT. They are pushing the anti-discipline movement. Don't be disciplined. Be a victim. They're harming you. They're against you. They're against the black people. They're against the Mexicans. They hate Asians. They hate old people, fat people, and you need to be, you can be as undisciplined as possible and we will still love you. Just show no discipline. And I think that is where people are finally drawing the line.
Yeah. I do think there's a huge shift right now. I think it is a huge shift.
Yeah, because also the online thing, sometimes I feel like it's also not real.
Yeah.
All the crazy comments and the people that like sometimes I feel like even like how many people are there really? You know, like how they had like back in the day, like these like thousands and thousands of groups on Facebook that are all bots trying to push one agenda.
Yeah.
And I think that's happening right now too, because people are not that dumb and people educate themselves and people listen to podcasts and there is so much need and so much young people coming in and there's people want to be healthy and people are fed up and I think they just overreached with the circus.
I think they did too. I totally think they did. And I think like it's inevitable that people are waking up en masse to what's going on. And that's where I think, again, it's important to recognize because when the pendulum swings the other way and people are starting to wake up, they will try again, like they do. This is just the reality. They being the powers that aren't actually, because we just continue to reify the idea that they have power, but they have the money, they have the media, they have the government, et cetera, et cetera. They will try to find clever ways to make people on this side of the pendulum step into a victim mentality regarding what they just went through when they are on this side of the pendulum, which is important to check yourself in every way possible to dissolve the victim mentality and continue to dissolve your conditioned beliefs and continue to question what you're being told by any one in a so-called position of authority, and learn to rely on your own intuition and learn to become self-sufficient and responsible for your own shit. It's important that we do that regardless of who we're listening to, regardless of which way the pendulum swings. So,
is there specific things that you can tell the audience what you do maybe on a daily basis
yeah,
to be your healthiest? I have a good one for you.
yeah,
So you see what I mean. I love turning off, going at my house on the switches, and I turn them all off at night. Besides the fridge or whatever, like if there's a dishwasher going, I'll keep that on. If we do laundry, I keep that on.
You're
But
talking about the breaker swings.
I talk about the breakers.
Ah.
Troy told me that, and it sounds crazy, but
Makes sense.
do it and see how you sleep. It's
Well, because there's no more dirty electricity.
yeah,
in the house then.
the effect
Yeah.
on your sleep. You sleep like you're sleeping outside in a tent, kind of.
Shit, I need to do that.
It's an insane thing, and I've done this experiment on my wife, like just doing it and actually doing it or not doing it, and seeing how she sleeps and how my whole family sleeps, and it's insane. It's
Wow.
just to get those 12 hours of no Wi-Fi, no electricity, or buzzing, just constant buzz. Even
Yeah.
here in the studio that we're sitting, like this constant buzz. To get that off for 12 hours, the effect is insane. It's almost like fasting.
Wow.
So that's a big one that I want to just do it. Just try it out. And then you'll see. Because I was also like, and it's kind of annoying to have no lights and all that stuff. But it's so cool.
I bet it feels great.
It feels so great. It feels so silent.
I bet.
It's so calming. You're like, whoa. Like, this is
Your
weird.
nervous system calmed down.
Everything calms down and you feel weird. Like, you feel like, and then you sleep like a baby. And you wake up like a rock in the morning. You're like, whoa, what happened? It's insane.
That's awesome. I got to try that. Thanks, Troy. Troy's the man, by the way. I'm happy he introduced us. This is cool, man. So what I do, a lot of people have meditative practices that they do. I do a Chinese practice called Qigong every
My
morning.
dad does that.
Oh, okay, yeah. And there's some Qigongs
Looks
that are
silly.
like, yeah, it does look silly. Well, that's what I was going to say. There's some Qigongs that are a lot more movement based where you're like slapping yourself and stuff like this. And I do some of that. But the Qigong that I do is a lot more breath based. You have in like yoga, you have the 7 chakras. In Qigong, you have what are called the 7 Dantians. Or Dantians, and those are your 7 primary energy centers, and it's your head, your stomach, your head, your heart, your stomach, hands, and your feet. And with Qigong, the way that I do it, I focus point my awareness, my individuated point of awareness towards those different spots in my body, my stomach, my chest, my head, and I breathe while I'm pointing my focused awareness, and I breathe into those places. And what it's sort of teaching you is that you become where you point your awareness. And what I mean by that is, I remember my first experience doing Qigong 3 years ago. I was breathing awareness into my chest, and then into my stomach, and like literally closing my eyes and focusing on this point as I'm breathing deeply into there. And then as we came back up, being instructed by this instructor that we were doing it through, to our head, and breathe awareness into our head, you have this realization that, oh my God, I was not here. I was here. I was here. I was in my feet. I was in my hands. And it teaches you that you literally become where you point your focused awareness, especially if you breathe into that place. And that has pretty amazing implications for life itself, because it teaches you that you become what you focus on. And it's a direct example, direct experience of that. So in the morning, I do Qigong when I first get up, and it's kind of hard this time of year, but in the summer especially, I time it where I'm doing Qigong as the sun is rising. So then I do sun gazing right after I've done Qigong, standing barefoot on bare earth. And that's like a perfect way to set up my day, because it just brings me into a sense of peace, calm, stillness, and centeredness. And then I find that when I'm doing that consistently on a day-to-day basis, my ability to manage stress, my ability to manage triggers that I have is much, much quicker and much more direct, because I'm in that state of centeredness and presence. And it is a spiritual experience just standing outside barefoot, breathing, looking at the sun. Like it is extremely profound, especially if you do it on a day-to-day basis. So that's what I do. I do qigong every morning. And then other things that I do, I previously, like before I went on this holistic health journey, if I got angry, I would get in fights a lot. I would get in fist fights. So I'd project my anger onto other people, which is not healthy, right? And then for some time, I started sort of just internalizing that pain. And then, if I would get frustrated and just stuffing it down, not expressing my anger because the pendulum swung the other way. And that would manifest as physical pain in my body. So now what I do if I get really fucking pissed off is I put on some boxing gloves and go punch a punching bag in my garage, or just go do a really, 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 really tough workout. But other than that, I eat organ meats quite a bit. I try to derive my food from local sources. I buy locally from farmers. Luckily in Texas, it's really easy to find raw milk and grass-fed, grass-finished beef everywhere. If you don't have your plug yet, I got you. I'll hook you up. And then spending time with my family and spending time with my kids and playing with them. And yeah, that's pretty much it, man. Like those are the consistent things that I do on a day-to-day basis. And it's really pretty simple, but I feel good. So, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alec.
Yeah, thanks, man. I'd like to share one more thing if I could.
Of course.
So, like I stated earlier, we created this educational docuseries called The End of COVID. It's at theendofcovid.com.
I love that. Everybody should see that little clip that you said at the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the What If My Body is Brilliant? Yeah. So that's one of our staple pieces of content for The End of COVID. So again, you can find that at theendofcovid.com. And for your audience, we actually made a 34% discount for those who purchase just using code CandyKen at checkout. So you can go to theendofcovid.com, and there you'll learn all about everything we've discussed here, but much more in depth. You'll learn everything that happened during COVID, detail by detail, and it's intended to help you dissolve fear. And one of the most important things is we aligned with this organization called the Sovereign's Way, and it teaches you how to, in any situation, whether it comes to climate-related stuff, whether it comes to another so-called pandemic, anything, to hold agents of the government, men and women of the government, accountable for trying to trespass against your rights. So we've aligned with that organization. That's a big piece of what we offer during the end of COVID as well, teaching you how to truly be free and approach life in a way that you ensure that no one can infringe and impose upon you. So you can find that at theendofcovid.com, and of course use CandyKen at checkout and you get 30% off. So
sick.
Yeah.
And then your Twitter?
My Twitter is Alec_Zeck.
Yeah.
And then I also
just fuck every other platform.
Yeah. Well, I'm on Instagram too.
But for how long?
I know. Dude, I'm on my 8th account. This is my 8th Instagram account. No joke.
It's all about how much influence you have until they shoot you.
100%. And you have to toe the line a little bit too. Like it's absurd. Yeah. So I'm on Twitter at Alec_Zeck, Instagram D_Alec_Zeck. And then my podcast, one of the top alternative health podcasts in the world. And I'll have you on at some point here soon, and live not too far. We'll do the same thing again, get to ask you some questions. You can find that at The Way Forward with Alec Zeck on any streaming platform, Spotify, Apple, or anything like that. So, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, man.
Thank you so much.
Dude, thank you. It was a pleasure. It was an awesome conversation.
Sweet.
Awesome.
All right.